Hey guys, welcome back. So now, many years ago, on a YouTube channel called DopeSpill Comics, you guys had been asking me to put together one big video for House of X and Powers of 10. And at the time I attempted to, but the computer I had just couldn't pull it off. Because for some reason my proxies just weren't approximating. But things are different now because during the pandemic I built a new computer. And I was thinking, since we recently wrapped on Volume 1 for Immortal X-Men and we just started Sins of Sinister, I wanted to go back and put together House of X and Powers of 10 and put it in one big video. So then moving forward, it's no longer stretched across two different playlists. And with that out the way, let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squad up in the comments for the first day, because I feel like we gotta do it a little different for this one. Alright, so for House of X and Powers of 10, the two of these together are really one large story that focuses on 4 different points in time, which are like your year 1 when the X-Men began, then as a result of that what they had to do 10 years later to preserve the mutant race, and then how that led to the war, then after that year 1000, which is like your ascension of the mutant race, or even more so that original dream coming to full fruition. And so now one of the first things that I really want to get into is that Moira McTaggart has seen most of this, because something new that Hickman introduced here is that Moira McTaggart, we discovered that she's a mutant with the power of reincarnation. And after her first death, in her second life, like from the womb, she realized she had all the memories from her previous life. But initially she didn't really know to consider herself a mutant, because back at this point in time, the mutant population hadn't really come out of the shadows. And as you guys know, much of that didn't really happen until Charles Xavier started the X-Men. And mutants definitely did exist before her, but prior to Charles Xavier and the X-Men, they just hadn't been in the forefront of society. And it really wasn't too long after that where the mutant population just got crazy. But for Moira, who was born Moira Kinross, I believe, and in her first life she had met Charles Xavier around the age of 17. But in her first life nothing really panned out from that. She had met Kenneth Cowan when she was like 15, then she married Kenneth when she was 19. Her and Kenneth had children and she lived out to be like 74, to where she then died of heart failure. But in her second life she still meets Kenneth at 15. They don't get married, they don't fall in love at 19, but in the second life she still goes to Oxford, she becomes a biology major, she starts the Mirror Island Research Institute, and it's in the second life where she sees Charles Xavier on television, who she's known for a couple lifetimes, and even still to this point just kind of casually from school. But when she sees Charles Xavier on the television telling the world that he's a mutant and explaining to the world what mutants are and how they're special and different, this intrigued her because she believed herself to be a mutant. So she hopped on the first plane to go see him, but she died in that plane crash and was never able to tell him that she was a mutant and why she believed so. And so now in life number 3, she enrolls in Oxford at the age of 16, and she intentionally speaks to and meets Charles Xavier with the intention of telling him what's been going on with her. But when she meets him at this time, he's very arrogant, and she believed that he thought that he was like God's gift to mankind. And so keep in mind, at this point she's about 134 years old, and with that just adding up her 2 prior lives, with her dying at 74 of her heart attack, and then in the second life she died at like what, 44 in the plane crash, and in her third life when she meets Charles she's about 16. And so at this point, after meeting Charles and not really wanting to open up to him, and understandably so because this is a younger and very different Charles Xavier, but because of this bad experience and her distaste for her ability thus far, from there she then starts Mirror Island Research, but in this third life she starts it 3 years earlier at the age of 28 instead of the age of 31, and at the age of 36 she defines the X gene, but her goal in this third life is to create a cure for mutation, to which at this point she believes to be a disease. But her plans for this cure are just to offer it to people who want to use it. So if you're born a mutant, you don't have to stay that way. You have the choice if you just want to be a regular human, which is something that definitely makes sense because not every mutant has like this extraordinary power. Not every mutant shoots concussive blasts from their eyes. Not every mutant has a crazy healing factor. Not every mutant can either fly or teleport. And this is something we talked about before, like with the Morlocks, who are more or less like your lower budget, underground, like literally underground in the sewers, but like your X-Men with not as much money and not as pretty. And for a number of them, their only mutation is like their appearance, and this quote-unquote cure would be like your answer for somebody like them. But with Moira creating this cure in her third life, this then resulted in her being confronted at the age of 42 by Mystique and Destiny. And you got like Pyro and Avalanche who are also there as well. And when they all arrive at Mirror Island, they just completely destroy her lab, but they come here to explain to Moira that this cure is more lethal to the mutant race than she realizes. But before we get into that, I do want to say that this relationship between Destiny and Mystique, this goes way back to your early 1981 Days of Future Past. Because if you guys remember, back at that time in your your Uncanny X-Men like issue 141, 142, it was pretty much the same group who had confronted the X-Men, because Destiny, who's like literally blind, but she's able to see the future, she had then at that time allied with Raven, who allied with the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, to help her prevent the events that she'd seen taking place in the 20th and 21st century by any means necessary. And at the time, one of those means was killing Senator Kelly, which of course put them at odds with the X-Men at that time, with Kitty Pryde arriving here from the future and allying with the X-Men in an attempt to pretty much stop the same catastrophe. And so now in this third timeline for Moira, they confront her, letting her know that they're aware about her reincarnation and that Destiny foresees that the human race will take this cure and later on weaponize it in order to eradicate the mutant race. So regardless of Moira's good intention or even personal agendas for this cure, it essentially will doom all mutants later on down the line. And they let her know, like, we're definitely gonna kill you, but we just want to let you know so when you come back you don't get to try this again, because if she does, Destiny will find her and kill her like for good. And Destiny lets her know that if she does attempt it again, that she will know and she will find out, because as it turns out, Moira actually has 10 or 11 lives to where she can come back depending on how she plays it. But Destiny lets her know that she'll cut that short if need be by just killing her before her mutant powers activate. And Moira doesn't definitively agree or disagree, and because of that, to push the persuasion a little bit further, Destiny has Pyro burn her slowly so she can die slowly and remember this conversation. And so now in her fourth life, she really kicks things into gear. She meets Charles Xavier at 13, she enrolls into Oxford once again at 16 for like the third life in a row, but this time around she marries Charles at the age of 23 because it took her about 3.5 lifetimes to realize that his arrogance was actually confidence. And on this fourth life she finally got to know him, and it was then that she fell in love with him. And so later on in this fourth life at the age of 35, her and Charles established the Xavier School for Gifted Children, and throughout this lifetime many of the events played out very closely to what we had seen in Uncanny X-Men through like what seems to be Avengers versus X-Men, but instead in this life, instead of Charles being killed by Cyclops, she actually dies at his side in a Sentinel attack, but she stuck with him through it all and she dies at his side. And so now going into her fifth life, to where this time at the age of 24, she's encouraged Charles to establish the mutant nation of Farway, which is supposed to be like your safe habitation for mutants, but this only lasted like 20 years because at the age of 44, Sentinels arrived to their nation, committing genocide and wiping out every mutant that was there. And so now thus far we skip over her sixth life, that I'm sure we'll get later, but on her seventh, it's here that she actually erases Boulevard Trask from history, with him being the one that began the Sentinel program. So she then dedicated this life to becoming an assassin, and I mean like his brother, nephew, everybody got it. And with doing this, she figured that if she were to stop him and his family, that this would end the Sentinel program. But she was wrong, because humanity's fear and hatred did not rely on Boulevard Trask, and eventually someone else would discover artificial intelligence and build Sentinels, which is something she compared much to like fire. Like if you kill the person who invented fire, eventually somewhere else someone's gonna rub some sticks together and they're gonna create a flame. Like it's only a matter of time before someone else comes with the discovery. And at the end of this seventh life, she's killed because she comes across this master mold factory where Sentinels are being built and they essentially take her out. And so now life number 8, Moira still goes to Oxford at the age of 16, but this time around she rejects Charles Xavier, and instead at the age of 24 she joins Magneto, because she pretty much told him everything that she knew up to this point. And knowing Magneto, he just sat there like, psh, I know, like these humans ain't no good, and he more or less just took over America. But it was also in this 8th life that Moira established the House of M by the age of 28 in order to protect the mutants, but this led to the War of M when she was 35, to where the War of M concluded with Magneto's death, which I can only imagine was a crazy fight. Like I would love to see the War of M actually play out. But when Magneto killed, she was in prison, to where she died 3 years later on a failed attempt to escape prison. And so now it's after this to where she makes the decision that's like my favorite of all her lifetimes, because at this time in her 9th life, at the age of 18, she awakens Apocalypse, and within like the first 3 years, Apocalypse kills Professor X and Magneto. And so now with this being her 9th life, because her 9th and 10th are a bit tricky, because at this point we really don't have a timeline for like the time of death for either one. But as this lifetime continued, they left Earth to rescue the First Horseman. Then after returning to Earth when she turned 28, that's when Apocalypse formed the X-Men. And still in this 9th life, 7 years later, when she turned 35, Apocalypse enslaved Mr. Sinister, then at the age of 42, the Apocalypse War began. But throughout this 9th lifetime, we really don't see how it ends. But I would assume like throughout this lifetime with her being modified by Apocalypse, that this particular lifetime was one of her longest 3. Because as far as her 6th life, her 9th life, and her 10th life, we still haven't seen a definitive end to them. But when we do finally make our way to her 10th life, it's here that we find out that she's given Charles Xavier another chance, but this time around, they're breaking all the rules. Because this time around, when she meets him for the first time, again, she literally has centuries of knowledge to share with him, which will work in the favor of mutant kind. In this 10th lifetime where she tells all this to Charles, she marries Joseph McTaggart, like way later on down the line when she's like 25. But I would have to make my guess that she doesn't marry Charles here, who in this 10th life she met when she was 17, possibly because after she showed him her mind, he was probably like, what? Like, okay, first of all, you hated me, then you married me, then you killed me. Like, nah, you and me, we not gonna work. Like, I can't imagine what you're gonna do next. Like, that's too much. But it was pretty much from here where Charles Xavier had got all this knowledge from Moira, which then led to him taking a very different approach throughout the years. Alright, so getting into Powers of 10, I want to build off some of the groundwork of what we had talked about in the previous House of X video, where I did the breakdown of where all this began, with the multiple life and times of Moira McTaggart, which ultimately led to her 10th life, to where she's like, okay, I tried doing it myself, I tried going to Charles Xavier, I tried going to Magneto, I tried going to Apocalypse, and none of those worked. And as far as number of lifetimes go, we know because of what Destiny told her, Moira pretty much has 10 and possibly 11 lives that she can live depending on the course of her actions, which is what brought us to lifetime number 10, where she said, okay, I'm using everything. I'm pulling out all the stops and I'm going to everybody, because throughout all these lifetimes, that's the one thing that she hasn't tried. And it's that journey that takes us to year 1 of Moira's lifetime, and from there we begin to see what happens from year 1 going into year 10, into year 100, and then into year 1000, with Moira telling Charles and others everything she's experienced throughout her different lives, because she's more or less learned at this point that regardless of how powerful some of these mutants are individually, that they really don't stand a chance unless they all can make this work out together. And so moving forward, this pretty much turns the X-Men and every mutant into the Golden State Warriors, and doing so with this 10th lifetime possibly being her last chance at making this work. And so now starting with year 1, to where on the surface it seems that Moira McTaggart is meeting Charles Xavier for the first time. But rather than doing this like the times that we talked about before in her previous lives, where she either ignored him and tried to make a quote cure for mutants, or she allied with him, doing everything that she could for mutants to live peacefully, or her attempting to help Magneto or even Apocalypse, but ultimately what this is showing us is that not just Charles but none of these leaders have been right up to this point. But at least this time around with giving Charles all of this information, and then from there making the attempt to get all the other leaders on board, and very much needing the help from Charles to do so that he can help Moira show others everything that she has seen over multiple lifetimes. But after showing Charles, this then takes them to meet Magneto, which makes sense with him being one of the first mutants that Charles has known personally, and even prior to them discovering each other's powers, Eric was one of the few people that Charles had many conversations with about how the future could play out in a way that was safe for mutants. But their existing history kind of built the basis for Charles to come out here to Island M with Moira, which at the time nobody else would even dare to visit. But I do love the conversation that they have getting into this, because it's very reminiscent of when they first met in what I would guess would be maybe 15 to 20 years prior to this point in Israel, when Charles Xavier traveled there to help Holocaust victims, which is also when he met Gabrielle Haller, who would later become the mother of Legion. But as far as how Hickman is handling this with the timeline, it's kind of tough to tell, with Moira first meeting Charles and he's walking, and then when they go to see Magneto, he's in a wheelchair, which could in that case make it be even longer amount of time. But one of the things that we pick up pretty quickly is that Charles and Eric at the time, who just went by Magnus, when they first met each other, for both of them it was the first time that they could actually sit down and talk to someone and really have a reasonable debate about either humans and mutants coexisting, or should mutants just take over before humans make the decision to get rid of them altogether as an act out of fear. And sure, most of this came from Magneto having a much rougher upbringing than Charles, but at the end of the day these were two people who wanted the exact same thing, which ultimately was the survival of the mutant race. And after revealing their powers to one another after facing Hydra and Baron von Strucker, neither of their ideals were swayed, and this is ultimately what caused them to drift apart. But when Charles comes here with Moira to meet Magneto and share with him everything that Moira has showed Charles, initially Eric is reluctant to do so, because at first when Charles tells him that neither of their ways are right, to Eric it just sounds like Charles is giving up. And in addition to that, he's a bit hesitant, because for all he knows, Charles could just be making all this up and just planting some kind of fictional tale in his mind. But off of the sheer friendship and history, Eric removes removes his helmet so Charles could let Moira in, and all of the lifetimes that he sees, it's just too much for anybody to make up, and he literally just watches his dream go wrong in multiple different scenarios. But after seeing everything that Moira had to show him, not only was he in, but he'll do whatever's needed of him to see this through. But before even hearing the details of how they're gonna do this, Eric lets him know that he's gonna give it everything he got, and if he notices Charles doing any less, he gonna straight up check him and let him know. And he says this more so to the extent that if there's any moment that Charles grows weak, that Eric will be right there to see this through. And so now from here, jumping forward into year 10, and still within Moira's 10th lifetime, but as we can see within this timeline, a lot of things throughout this past 10 years have played out differently than the way we've known them to play out throughout the history of X-Men, X-Factor, likely even X-Force, Excalibur, like everything's different. And one of those main differences are your flowers of Krakoa, which we see Colossus picking from Krakoa so the X-Men can plant them in Westchester, the blue area of the moon, on Mars, the Savage Land, Washington DC. And through the course of time, these plants of Krakoa will serve 6 different purposes. Well, really 2 different purposes. 3 for humans to be used as advanced drugs, and the other 3 pertain to mutant transport and habitation. And so now the 3 that are for humans, labeled L, I, and M, with the L that extends human life, the I is like your super antibiotic, and the M cures diseases of the mind. And on the instructions it says that they're just for humans, but I have my speculations of mutants taking them too. But as for the other 3 flowers, which are exclusive to mutants, for these you have your gateway, to where once planted they can provide a transit from wherever you're at to Krakoa. The second, which is your habitat, is able to produce a self-sustaining environment much like Krakoa, but it's plants like this one which make it possible to be planted on Mars and essentially create a habitat in a place that would otherwise seem unlivable. And all the while that it's there, though separate from Krakoa, it's still connected to Krakoa's consciousness. And so now the 6th one, which is very similar to the 5th, which creates the habitats, but the 6th one, which occurs unnaturally, it creates habitats within Krakoa's ecosystem that are not a part of Krakoa's consciousness, and they appear very much like tumors within the ecosystem. And the 6th one, which is referred to as your no place flower, we'll get a bit deeper into that later on, because I believe the concept in itself of the no place flower, it leans deeper into your lost years within this timeline, and Mr. Sinister and him having his own agenda, and I don't want to lean too heavy into all of that just yet. But mainly just keep in mind the first 3 flowers were converted to like pills to help humans and provide advanced pharmaceuticals for the human race, and the second 3, which apply to the mutants on Krakoa, the first 2 make a way for safe transit and habitation, while the 3rd within this group is very obscure at the moment because it's something that will definitely come back when we go deeper into what happens 100 years from now, and after that 1,000 years from now. But for now, just keep it in the back of your mind, because for now we're really just setting the tone for the groundwork for the 4 periods in time along this timeline. But so now still within year 10, you have your relationship between the humans and the mutants, to where the humans see that the mutants, they pretty much built their own nation here in Krakoa, which they didn't ask permission for, but rather is something that they just did. And prior to the point of Charles Xavier making his proposal to the humans of what they could offer, he had been leading mutants out from different locations like the Xavier Academy in Westchester and other locations like the Jerusalem habitat, which Xavier used to provide safety and transport before making his offer to the humans and even making them aware of Krakoa, which was really smart because this gave the mutants a head start to not only ensure the safety of mutants in other locations, but also force the hand of the humans in their decision once Charles Xavier made his proposal to them, which in turn offered humans a benefit, but in the form of a deal that they had to take, because at the moment that the humans became aware, Charles and the others were well off into their plans, which would take decades to come to fruition. And so now when members of the American government made their way to this Jerusalem spot, and only able to do so via mutant escort, when they arrived to mull over the details that Charles had telepathically proposed, when they arrived there, they're met by Magneto. And it's almost like Xavier was like, Magneto, I'm gonna let you handle this one, because this way they most likely won't read the terms and conditions and they'll just click agree. But even though on one hand the humans are shaking hands with the mutants, and mainly for 2 reasons, with the first being that they're years ahead in planning and months ahead as far as a lot of their execution, but for the humans in their other hand, which is behind their back, for a number of years they've been making plans themselves. And this came by the way of an organization that they had formed by the name of Orcus, and they began 2 years prior only in the form of observation, but they had did this by pulling humans from every strategic organization you can think of, and it was formed initially because of the spike in mutant population, but in forming this organization they pulled people from every strategic group in the world. And I mean, they got people from AIM, SHIELD, Strike, Sword, Alpha Flight, Hammer, Armor, and Hydra. But with patrolling the main 3 factors of the human threat, that's where the observation began, with them observing mutant population, mutant related financial purchases, and also substantial territorial shifts that were made by mutants, but in the past 2 years, they were only in a mode of observation. But in the latter half of those 2 years, they got red flags on all 3 of the categories which they considered mutants to be the most dangerous, because with population, the mutant population was spiking. And while observing financial, Xavier purchases the 7th largest pharmaceutical company in the world, which he would later use to distribute the first 3 human drugs that we had talked about earlier. And last but not least, in the category of territory, you got the establishment of Krakoa, which essentially gave them red flags on all 3 fronts. And so now within Orchis, you have Dr. Alia Gregor, who's head of science command under Dr. Killian Devo, and she had began humanitarian research into mutant repopulation following the events of the Genosian genocide, which is something we had seen back in Grant Morrison's New X-Men, where we got the crazy story of Charles Xavier's twin sister, Cassandra Nova Xavier, who, as it turned out, she was the manifestation of what the Shi'ar would call Mumandri, I believe how you say it. But according to the Shi'ar's mythology, this particular being or entity, it's something that one would have to fight in the womb before birth, with this entity being the opposite of whoever needed to be born. And this essentially is what Cassandra was to Charles Xavier, with him having to kill her in the womb before being born in order to make it out alive. I know it's crazy, but as it turned out, the battle between these two induced the labor of Charles' mother, to where at birth Charles survived and Cassandra was announced dead at delivery. But over the course of some years later, with Cassandra being this opposite of Charles Xavier, but also being this alien entity, during the course of Grant Morrison's X-Men, she spent that time reforming her body cell by cell and planning her revenge towards Charles Xavier. And so after she returned, she recruited the nephew of Bolivar Trask, and she takes him to a secret wild master mode that I believe was like in South America or something like that. But she had taken Donald Trask here, the nephew of Bolivar Trask, only to use him because he had voice authorization. And after painfully stealing like 3 billion letters of his DNA and copied them to herself, to where she used the authorization to this wild master mode to commit genocide in Genosha. And so now an important thing to keep in mind is that with your traditional master mode, Bolivar Trask designed it in order to just produce multiple sentinels, but this is also something that Cassandra considered inadequate. And this is one of the reasons she considered your wild master mode to be a bit more effective, because it would produce sentinels out of anything, which is one of the main reasons at the time that this attack in Genosha was so successful. And when this happened, this produced the slaughter of 16 million mutants. And prior to this point, Dr. Alia Gregor, who is now a member of Orchis, she had originally believed that the mutant population, it would never overtake the human population. And mainly because of scientific advancements, breakthroughs in genetic engineering, and artificial intelligence. But after the genocide of Genosha, she realizes that had it not been for the genocide that had taken place, that not only would the mutant race outnumber the human race, but prior to the attack on Genosha, this would have taken place in only 10 years. And with the number of mutants who were slain in Genosha, all this did was push it back to 20 years. And so now at this point, we find that Orchis, who appears to use pieces of the old master mode and fine-tune them to create the station that is like your mother to your brother and sister machines. And they've reached this level of progress throughout the course of like 6 months, likely due to the fact that the wild master mode is able to produce other sentinels in order to carry out this work at a quicker rate. And this station, though not perfect, like they ran into some snags over the course of 6 months, and mainly because of Orchis rushing in order to get it operational, with them recently discovering that time is not on their side, but also with the recent discovery of Charles Xavier purchasing the 7th largest pharmaceutical company, and months after that, the discovery of Krakoa, they switched the production of the sentinels that they had built into mining more materials so they can build more sentinels. And so now from here, we jump over to Mystique, Sabretooth, and Toad, who have broken into damage control to receive some confidential information. And prior to this point, as far as public knowledge, damage control has really just been collecting hazardous weapons and different technologies which may pose as a threat to the government. But what we come to find out is that as a result of Reed Richards missing after Secret Wars, and during the time that Tony Stark was presumed dead during Civil War II, damage control had also been collecting their technology, all the while making plans for a little bit more, which is why Mystique, Sabretooth, and Toad are here to steal this information off their local drives and take it back to Krakoa. But after they receive the files that they need and they make their way out, they're met by the arrival of the Fantastic Four. And when they arrive, Sabretooth, he tells Mystique and Toad that he'll hold them off so that they can get back to Krakoa with the information. But as it turned out, this didn't work out too well for him. And it's like, come on, think about it. Like, Sabretooth versus the Fantastic Four is really no contest. And we see this not only with the Thing who clobbers the mess out of them, but also when Mystique and Toad make it through the gateway. But when Sabretooth Sabretooth leaps full speed into a wall created by Sue Storm in front of the gateway, and she then just traps him in a box and he's done. Like, he really didn't have much of a chance, especially when Sue and Reed showed up. But what I like that Hickman does, like, as soon as this happens, Cyclops arrives and he's like, okay, these are mutants who caused this, and along the terms of amnesty for citizens of Krakoa, he insists that Reed Richards just lets him go and Krakoa will take it from here. And all the while that he's doing this, Cyclops is just acting like he didn't know why Mystique, Toad, and Sabretooth were here, but all the while Cyclops, Sabretooth, Mystique, Toad, Magneto, Charles, they all been working together. And with Cyclops showing up here and just acting like Krakoan police, waving around amnesty and saying we'll take it from here, he really doesn't try that hard to get Sabretooth out of this snag, which surprises Sabretooth because he knows that this mission was a mission that the X-Men were in on together, but Cyclops doesn't necessarily try too hard, one, because it could likely blow the cover of this whole operation, but also I think because it's Sabretooth and he's kind of like, who cares? So as a result, Cyclops just leaves Sabretooth there, but upon leaving he drops the idea in the mind of Sue and the others that Krakoa is a place of safety for those born with special gifts, and if their son Franklin Richards ever needs a place to stay, that they're saving room especially for him. And him doing this just kind of drops the idea in their mind for Sue and the others to kind of mow over. And so now upon the arrival of Mystique and Toad, who more or less had to leave Sabretooth behind, they arrive back in Krakoa with a flash drive filled with the information that they had stolen from Damage Control. And like I mentioned before, this whole data heist was a group effort. Mystique, Magneto, Charles, Cyclops, everybody was in on it, even poor Sabretooth who got left behind. And when Mystique and Toad arrive here, Mystique begins to express her request to wanting something more for the risk that they've been taking, but Charles tells her that creating a better world for mutants, that this alone should be reward enough. But before I go any further, we gotta talk about this helmet that Charles Xavier is wearing, because I'm pretty sure that this is Cerebra, which is like your successor to Cerebro when Cerebro was destroyed. And I say this because we have also seen this version of Cerebra in Grant Morrison's new X-Men, because also at the time, Cassandra Xavier, the twin sister of Charles Xavier, and I'm not gonna go too deep into the argument of this being actually his sister, or just the alien Mumundri, whatever entity that she was supposed to be. I'm gonna leave that alone. That whole thing just kind of threw me for a loop, but I'm pretty sure that this is Cerebra, and it's likely that Hickman has brought this back as an additional reference to Grant Morrison's new X-Men to kind of show us that the events that had taken place there, that they still take place within this timeline in some way, form, or fashion. But here's the part that gets me, because at the time when she made her way to Cerebra, to where the X-Men thought she was taking it in order to finish off the other mutants after the genocide of Genosha, but instead when this happened, she actually used it to switch bodies with Charles Xavier, which is kind of messed up because Emma Frost pretty much snapped her neck, or more or less snapped his neck, with that really being Charles Xavier after Cassandra used Cerebra in order to make the switch. And so now this is one of those things throughout the course of Powers of 10 that just has me thinking, like, how much of new X-Men is Hickman actually keeping? Because as it turned out at the time, with Emma Frost snapping Charles's neck while he was in the body of Cassandra, that didn't necessarily kill him. And Cassandra, who was in Charles's body, she shot Charles so he couldn't tell them the truth, and also so that she could hold up the illusion of stealing the body of Charles and continue to fool the X-Men. But I will say this, hopefully, just hopefully, with the return of Cerebra, that Hickman is still holding true to the conclusion where the X-Men figured this out by way of Jean Grey, who later returned Charles Xavier back into his body, and with the help of Emma Frost, they trapped Cassandra back into her own body, her old dead body. But now back to Powers of 10, and hopefully you guys kind of feel me on this, but I feel like Jonathan Hickman is taking my brain and just tied it in a knot, because the madness is making sense, but at the same time there's so many possibilities in between everything that's going on. But either way, back to Powers of 10. But so now at this point, where the X-Men have more or less made their way through these files, and they discover the confidential plans which were being held at Damage Control, they discover that on those drives that they had the schematics for a mother mode, which is pretty much a master mode that makes master modes. And when they see this, like, just pretty much off of the idea of what happened in Genosha, seeing this is like their nightmare's biggest nightmare. And so now from the information that they have, they're aware that construction is completed, but at this point in time it's still in a dormant phase because it appears that they're waiting for the right mutant target in order to launch this attack. But also on this drive, they're filled in on the rest of the details on Orchis, like the organizations which they recruited from prior to this point, and much of the details of Orchis which we talked about earlier. But in addition to seeing the schematics for Mother Mode and being made aware aware of the number of organizations involved in Orchis, they also discovered that Orchis already has the plans to make Nimrod operational. And although in this timeline Nimrod hasn't come to fruition just yet, they're already well aware of who Nimrod is, mainly because of the revelation of the life and times of Moira McTaggart. And with them discovering this and seeing Nimrod already on the way and the mother mold already built, this is pretty much like the humans jumping from your brick-sized cell phone but having the plans for your iPhone 11 tucked away somewhere in a corner, because Nimrod is just that much more advanced than your standard issue Sentinel. But with discovering all this forces the X-Men to have to go tens of millions of miles into space and take out this station before it becomes operational and produces Nimrod this early, which is definitely a tall order. But the X-Men really don't have a choice but to attempt to stop this from happening, or at least prolong it for as long as possible. Alright, so continuing with Powers of 10, and in this video moving forward into your 100th year and after that your 1000th, from the details that we've been given at this point, your 100th year, it really just picks up with the mutants of Krakoa suffering from your evasion and relocation confrontation. And this is one of the things that more or less starts the Lost Years, and I'll get into what that is and why this is where it starts in just a little bit, but more or less this is the point in time where things start to go downhill. And so now the evasion relocation confrontation, and I kind of feel like Oswald Bates just saying that, you know, evasion and relocation proclamation of confrontation. It just sounds like something he would explain best. But for real, the evasion relocation confrontation is really exactly what it sounds like. The mutants of Krakoa constantly having to move and rebuild with the reoccurring threat of being discovered by Hounds and Nimrod. And so now in the last video, we had talked about the X-Men's data heist from Damage Control back in year 10, which led them to the discovery of both the plans for Mother Mode and archived data on Nimrod. And we will get back to more on Lifetime number 10, but in this video, we're going to focus a bit more on Lifetime number 9, with it arguably being Nimrod's most effective run throughout Moira's lifetimes. But along with this, one of the things that pushed the mutants into evasion and relocation, it was also the Sentinel Hound program. And Sentinel Hounds we've seen a number of times before, with slight differentiations to how they originate, but ultimately they serve the same purpose, and that being mutants trained to hunt down other mutants. But unlike in the past where we've seen times where mutants were brainwashed and forced into this servitude, in Powers of 10, 100% of the hounds were born in captivity and bred for the purpose of hunting mutants. But also, much like before, their appearance, it's also formed with the intention to put fear into their targets, and if not fear, at the least invoke sympathy. And so now in Powers of 10, this hound program, at least in the form that is similar to what we've seen before, this is like your phase 1. And later on they would upgrade this method by putting out a newer version of hounds with black brains, which were unreadable, but only a few of these particular hounds were effective. And because of this, a majority of them, after being deployed, sided with the mutants to whom they connected with. They were given names, but also with them turning and helping out the mutants, they also turned out to be some of their most powerful assets. But mainly with the Hound program, when it was set in place, and this caused the mutants of Krakoa to move from location to location, this is the part of the evasion relocation confrontation that caused the population to dwindle down to crazy low numbers. And at the beginning of this time, this is what brought the mutants towards the brink of extinction. And so now with this, I want to get into Apocalypse for a little bit, because back when we talked about House of X, we discovered that Moira McTaggart had teamed up with Apocalypse in her 9th lifetime, where she had awoken Apocalypse at the age of 18, killed Xavier at 19, killed Magneto at age 21, and when she was at the age of 24, her and Apocalypse began to recruit the different horsemen of Apocalypse. And so then at 28, Moira and Apocalypse, they then formed the X-Men. And at the age of 35, and I want to stay here for a minute, at the age of 35, when Moira turned 35 in her 9th lifetime, this is when Apocalypse enslaved Mr. Sinister. And this is something that will become more significant within Moira's 9th lifetime from the time that she turns the age of 50 moving forward. And I'm skipping that far just to try to state a fewer topics within this single video. But the significance of Moira turning 50 in her 9th lifetime is the fact that in this lifetime that this is when Nimrod goes online. And from the time that Nimrod goes online for like the next 8 years, this is when your confrontation and evasion got crazy and the mutant population started dropping to ridiculously low numbers. And so now to remedy the shortage of mutant population, this is when we got the beginning of Mr. Sinister's mutant breeding pits, which started when Moira was 58 and was active by the time she was 60, and mainly for the purpose of boosting the mutant population. with mutants at this point in time being slain at a high rate, which is exceeding the product of natural reproduction. And so now if you guys remember, previously we had talked about the X-Men planting different plants from cocoa, and one of which served the purpose of building habitation. And one of the locations where they established this habitation was on Mars. And it's here that Mr. Sinister establishes the breeding pits to produce more mutants. But see, here's the thing. When he was greenlit to do this, he modeled it very closely to the Sentinel Hound program, to which at this point are like your OG hounds, and the black brain ones wouldn't come till 30 years later. And so now from these mutants that Sinister would produce, he would eventually implement his version of the black brain hounds, but this wouldn't come around until the 4th generation of mutants that Sinister produced. And so now from the 1st generation, from the breeding pits, the mutants that would come from here, they would possess traits of detection, pursuit, and deception, and those 3 traits were likely for their survival. But with these 3 traits, with detection likely to detect incoming threats, pursuit which likely also deal with evasion, once again for survival, and deception likely for cloaking themselves and others, which for one were all traits that made your later batch of hounds successful when they side with the mutants, which is probably the main reason that the remaining leaders went with the whole idea. But with Sinister being Sinister, both by name and literally, once he got this approval and endorsement, he did things much differently than what had been planned. And with doing so, he focused on producing mutants with more aggressive power sets and militaristic traits. But the results of doing so were a little bit all over the place. And so now the first of these 4, this class was called the fodder class, and mainly because by definition fodder is just like a person or thing that's only regarded as material for specific use. And the mutants that were produced of this class, they were just divergent copies of a singular DNA source, of which had a pure uncompromised X gene, which more or less made them variants of their original mutant counterpart. So for this reason they would have the same powers, they would very much look like whatever particular mutant, but they would execute behaviors towards whatever purpose they're given. And so now your 2nd and 3rd generation, which are both considered your chimera class, your 2nd generation mutants were a product of 2 different X genes. But as for your 3rd class, these mutants contain up to 5 X genes. And so now with this being done, this class, the successful portion, they were considered to be like the turning point in the war. But within this class, not every one of them had 5 X genes, like Rasputin for example, who's like your mixture of Kid Omega, Kitty Pryde, Gunther Bane, I believe, who can produce like energy fields around himself to protect himself, but also with your mix of Laura Kinney with the sprinkle of your Rasputin. But with all of this, she's like crazy powerful. But before I get into the 4th generation, I want to stay with the 3rd just a little bit longer, which was considered 90% successful with a 10% failure rate. And it's within this 10% of the 3rd generation where you have these mutants who were labeled as failures because they weren't militaristic nor aggressive. And for that reason, this 10% of this 3rd generation, they were labeled cardinal. And mainly because their powers were passive, their personality was passive, a majority of them had their obsessions with creation myths, or perhaps even religion, but they also refused the ideal of taking on personal names. And so as for the 4th generation, this is where you had your Omega based chimera, but also with this 4th generation, this is where everything just went completely wrong. Because the 4th generation, which was also designed to have a hive mind, which was intentionally corrupt by design of Mr. Sinister, and by the time this was figured out, it was too late, and it led to the destruction of Krakoa, destroying 40% of the mutant population. But then also on Mars, you had the remainder part of this 4th generation, which self-destructed and destroyed the Martian breeding pits. And so now with this taking place, in hindsight, it's believed that Mr. Sinister had planned this all the way back to the Evasion Relocation Proclamation. So it's like he created the problem in order to mislead the leaders, in order to appoint him to be the solution, and then grant him the resources that he wanted. And so now with that 8-minute setup out the way, and we start to get into more of the things taking place, and still within year 100 at this point. But this is the part where in the previous video where I'd mentioned us getting glimpses into different portions and different timelines, much like what I talked about with Apocalypse in this video, we continue here with Moira's 9th life. And with that, at this particular point where we see Silo Bell, who's one of your final model black brain hounds, which were bred and created by the Sentinels, but Silo Bell is one that eventually traded sides and started helping the mutants. And it's here to where her and 3 others who are on this heist for information from the Sentinel archives, Percival, who came as well, he was slain in action, but with the 2 of them you also have Rasputin, and the nameless one that looks like your Red Nightcrawler, who I believe is more or less referred to as Cardinal, even though that's not his actual name, but because he was of that 3rd generation that produced your passive mutants that are referred to as Cardinal, for that reason I'm just gonna call him Cardinal, at least to the point that we see others pop up. But at this point where Silo Bell is taken, Rasputin makes her attempts to save her, but she's ultimately unsuccessful. But with this turning out with Silo Bell being taken by the Sentinels and leaving this team down down to 2 with it just being Rasputin and Cardinal, Cardinal essentially has to use a black seed in order to get the 2 of them out of there so that they can meet with the remaining surviving mutants. But it's here where they meet with the remaining mutants to where they share the information which they've successfully stolen from the Sentinel archive in order to move to the next step. And when they arrive here at Krakoa, there's a lot of things to take in right now, because when Rasputin and Cardinal arrive without Percival, they're met here by like 5 others. But the first 4 that we see here, they're like your horsemen of apocalypse. And the first, who is like your Magneto looking guy, his name is North, just like Kanye's daughter, and he's a 2nd gen Chimera, who once again are mixed with 2 separate X genes, with his being Polaris, the daughter of Magneto, and Emma Frost. And just going from left to right, then you got Zorn, who's his original self, Wolverine, he's his original self, and keep in mind that any original mutant who hasn't been mixed or manufactured, they're considered a pureblood. And last but not least, to your far left, you have Famine, who's a symbiotic combination of Cypher, who was killed at one point or another, but he was combined with Krakoa. And for the record, I just refer to him as Famine because he's that particular horseman. Some refer to him as Krakoa, but he's not specifically Krakoa because he's a symbiotic combination of Krakoa and Cypher. Alright, so from here we jump from like your pocket Krakoa location over to Asteroid K. And this kind of leans into what I talked about with the different plants and their purposes, because I believe that your black seed, which Cardinal had used, that it has an association with your no place flower, which originally was like your cancerous flower, meaning that it was like a cancer to Krakoa, meaning that it would create habitats that would exist outside of the ecosystem. But at this point in your 100-year place in time, I believe that Famine has found a way to use these different pocket habitats, if you will, in order to create a quick and safe place of refuge that the mutants can go to before they actually get home. And much of this once again is because of Sinister. He set everyone up to fuel his personal agendas, and now the few remaining mutants have to be more cautious as a result of it. And this is why I believe this group used the black seed to escape into a special habitat before arriving home, to which at this point is no longer Krakoa, but at this point now it's Asteroid K, to where the population here on Asteroid K is a whopping 8. And after the destruction of the nation of Krakoa, the remaining 10,000 mutants, they reside in Shi'ar space, with about 2,000 on the home world and the other 8,000 spread throughout. But one more thing about the black seed real quick. Now it's unclear at this point if they use it to create a different habitat or if they just use it to create a stealth door, with the others eventually becoming traceable. But at this point I'm still leaning towards the habitat idea, mainly because that was the purpose of the 3rd black flower. But while here on Asteroid K, Rasputin and Cardinal, they followed the group of horsemen to meet with their leader Apocalypse, who more or less gives them a speech on how important this information was that they had to take, which we'll eventually find out pertains to the person who's in stasis behind him. And I believe the only people who are aware of who's actually in there are the 4 horsemen at this point in time. But Apocalypse mainly just tells Rasputin and Cardinal, like, put it this way, the information on this drive is so important that if he needed to kill all of them just to get it, he would do it without hesitation. Which is kind of like, okay, thanks for the encouragement. And so now going through the drive, Famine, who's also referred to as Krakoa, but who's really Krakoa and Cypher, and this is why I actually call him Famine, because it just makes it a little bit easier. But while searching through these files, he finds the information on the drive which they had taken, which actually gives him the location to the real information that they need in order to consider this mission a true success. And the real information being named Genesis Protocols version Nimrod. And it's critical that they retrieve this information, even though there are a couple men short, to where one of which, in that individual being Percival, who had allowed them to go in undetected, he's no longer with them. And because of this, at this point they know that they have to go in, to where at some point they'll receive heavy resistance, and it's here where Apocalypse tells them that he will lead them and he promises that they won't fail. Alright, so prior to this point, I've talked about the layout because I felt like getting into year 100, it was really necessary that we talked about Apocalypse and some of the things that him and Moira McTaggart achieved within this timeline, but also with doing so, leaning a bit heavier into Mr. Sinister and the betrayal event, which at this point in time, it's one of those things you gotta kind of read between the lines, but I really feel like it deserved its own video early on because it explained the creation of a lot of the new characters, like Cardinal and Rasputin, and others who seem on the surface like familiar faces, and some who are like Wolverine and Zorn. But also with that, you have characters who are a product of the 4 generations of Sinister's creations, like North, who's your green Magneto looking guy, who's actually a product of Generation 2 when Sinister combined the mutant powers of Polaris and Emma Frost. But in that video, with going over all this for a number of the characters, I really feel like it was much needed to get that better understanding moving forward, mainly because of the significance, and more or less help you guys differentiate who's who, how they got here, and essentially where are all the other mutants. But like we talked about in the last video and pretty much around where we left off, when the Sentinels had taken back Sila Bell, who originally was your state-of-the-art hound, of which I believe there was just 2 generations, but of that last generation they were created with black brains so that their minds couldn't be readable, mainly for stealth and infiltration. But in a heist where the mutants had taken sensitive data from the Sentinels, Percival was killed and Sila Bell was taken in to answer to Omega and Nimrod. And this is one of the first things that showed us that at some point in time, with the humans creating the machines in order to protect them, that there was a shift to where the machines took over. And leading them you have Nimrod, but above Nimrod you have Omega. And Omega is the evolved future version of Karima, who's the Omega Sentinel that we'd seen back in year 10, but in this timeline we see that she's pretty much outlived everyone to where she's of higher rank because she's been there the longest. But when they bring Sila Bell here to the human machine monolith so that she can answer to Nimrod and Omega, Omega mainly wants to figure out what were the mutants trying to take, did they find what they were looking for, and most importantly, why were they looking for it, to which she refuses to answer. And because she's one of the Black Brain Hounds, they're not able to extract this information from her because by design, the Black Brain Hounds, they were supposed to just report back by means of loyalty. And because of this really leaves Omega stuck without a means to get information out of Sila Bell. But because Nimrod is a collector of data and information, and originally information on mutants in order to protect humans, but with collecting data being one of Nimrod's functions, as a result he's built a repository to where he has these tanks that'll thoroughly analyze a mutant's DNA and their minds and archive all of that information, and doing so in a process which is called a bath. And he is super excited to try this on Sila Bell, probably too excited. And part of that has to do with her, like they don't know if that's going to get the information out of her that they need, because she's a Black Brain Hound who was designed to avoid things like this by any means necessary. But more or less Nimrod is like, I will keep you in there for as long as it takes, and any information that can be retrieved, we'll more or less just take what we can get. And as long as that takes, even if it's another 1,000 years, we'll just wait it out. And this essentially leads to the end of Sila Bell within this timeline. But also in this 100th year, you have the Temple of Concordance, the Church of Ascendancy, which is where we get a deeper look into that shift between the humans and the machine that I talked about earlier. Because essentially after the Hound program had ended, with a number of the Black Brain Hounds switching sides and helping mutants, and there still were a few Hounds from that program who were successful and continued to operate, but even still they were a minority. But along with that, you had humans who were with them who were considered hunters. But ultimately the hunters and even the rest of the humans, they were deemed as flawed as well. And for that reason, they demanded that the humans undertake an ascension that will make them half human and half machine. And though they will become physically half human and half machine, ideally they're shedding their humanity 100%, but the physical 50-50, it would keep a part of them human so they will remember what they were and what they've become. And so now for the humans, your active hounds, your hunters, they all worship the machines like they're gods. And for that reason, the humans who underwent this, they offered their children to undergo this as well, because this became their religious practice, much like a form of circumcision. But here at the Church of Ascendancy, North, Zorn, Rasputin, and Cardinal, they make an explosive entrance, which is anything but subtle. And with them being here, like once again, this is one of those moments where you know that eventually, like once Sentinels respond, that these guys don't really have the likelihood of making it out of here. So for that reason, we know just with them being here alone, that they're performing this attack with like a ready to die mind state. And in my opinion, Cardinal is the best example of that, because with him being created as a 3rd generation product of Mr. Sinister, to whom were supposed to be bred fighters, Cardinal was born of that 10% from the 3rd generation who was considered a failure. And like we talked about in the Sinister Betrayal video, the mutants of that 10%, their powers were considered passive. And prior to this point for Cardinal, he wouldn't engage in battle because his nature prohibited him from doing it. But at this point, for the first time, we finally see him fighting alongside with the other mutants and being one of the first examples of someone going against either their apocryphal nature and just going with the flow of the popular belief, but in his case, he's taken it a step further and he's come to fight for what he truly believes in, regardless of his design or even his physical limitations. And so when this attack gets the attention of Omega, who can also see the fire from the explosion across town, she urges Nimrod that they should head over there. But instead, Nimrod, who can care less, he doesn't want to leave from investigating the initial break-in from which they had captured Sila Bell. But real quick, I want to say as far as Nimrod, this just plays into the development of who we see him become in year 100 of Powers of 10. Because on one hand, Nimrod to the Sentinels is much like what Apocalypse is to mutants, because he stands far above the group as far as power ranking, and for the longest time time he's represented the full potential of what they could be. And there's a number of moments throughout Powers of 10 where we see both Nimrod and Apocalypse speak to their subjects or even speak to others with the exact same wording like "give me your eyes," which is a phrasing that could have been said a number of other ways, but I love that Hickman had them both say it the exact same way. And the reason why is because with comparing the two, like in the last video, when Rasputin and Cardinal brought the data back to Apocalypse and the other horsemen, Apocalypse told them like, if I had to kill you to get this information, I would. And with Nimrod, rather than just saying that, we see him actually do it to a couple of the hunters, and only because one of them complained about being too tired to listen to the information that Nimrod was trying to share with them. And granted, Nimrod and Apocalypse, they value information for different reasons. With Nimrod for security and Apocalypse for salvation, it really just shows us like the brilliant comparison of how they're very much the same, with Nimrod at this point being a machine who believes the machines are greater than humans, which has pretty much been how Apocalypse views himself and mutants for the longest time. But with Omega not being able to pull Nimrod away from his investigation, she heads towards the church in response to the attack, and she brings Sentinels for days. And this is really just a testament to how many Sentinels they have at their disposal, which is why at their previous breach they really needed Percival to cloak their movement so they can get in undetected, because otherwise this armada just isn't one that you fight your way through. But while this is happening, Apocalypse and the two other horsemen, which are Wolverine, who's the horseman of war, and then your other nameless horseman who's the hybrid between Krakoa and Cypher, who's your horseman of famine. But when we see them here at the Sentinel Archive, of which they snuck into after utilizing the location of the information they truly needed, of which Percival and Salabel died just so they could get it. Like, they died so these guys would know where to get what they truly needed, which we talked about in the previous video had been the Genesis protocols for Nimrod. And when they get there, they get the information fairly quickly because they know exactly where to go. But before they can get out, Wolverine picks up the scent of something or someone incoming, and he looks around the corner to where he just sees this light, and it's here where they're met with the arrival of Nimrod, who had received an alert that they had broken into his archives, to which he still can't figure out why they're here or what they're looking for, though he does discover them looking through some of the oldest files. But back over at the Church of Ascension, to where at this point Cardinal's already dead, and likely North is dead as well too, Zorn is almost dead, and we're left to this standoff between Rasputin and Omega, to which Omega has plenty of Sentinels left with her. And with Zorn here, what Rasputin does is she removes his mask just before he dies, because within his head is a black hole, and once Rasputin opens it up, all of them are just sucked inside. And this is something Zorn was also willing to do, with him knowing the greater cause of this mission. But also at this point, Apocalypse gives Wolverine the data crystal with the information that they had taken, sending him through a Krakoan portal back to Asteroid K so they could complete their mission. And with doing this, this leaves Apocalypse to face off with Nimrod, to where Nimrod is like, bump the one-on-one, I'm finna jump you single-handedly. And I imagine, like, if Apocalypse ever had to tell the story of how this went down, it would have been like that old Kevin Hart story about his dad where he was like, man, I got jumped by an octopus. Like, first there was one of them, the next thing I seen was just a bunch of hands. But for Apocalypse, who also has been confirmed at this point to be an Eternal, he does not win this fight. And though I don't think he was killed, he may pop back up in year 1000, possibly in one of Nimrod's baths, which would be just crazy to see. And mainly because with Nimrod building his library, I couldn't imagine him just wanting to get rid of Apocalypse. But it's immediately after this that we see Wolverine making his arrival to Asteroid K and awakening Moira. And so now prior to this point, and still within Moira's 9th lifetime, where she had awoken Apocalypse at the age of 18. It wasn't actually till she was 42 when the Apocalypse War began, and 8 years after that when she turned 50 and Nimrod came online. And it's well after that where Sinister produces your different generations with the different mutants, and that 4th generation collapsing Mars like we talked about in the last video, that happened when Moira was 100, and that was when Asteroid K was established, with Krakoa being reduced to half a person, and the breeding pits of Mars being destroyed by Sinister's 4th generation. The remaining mutant population of 10,000 went to Shi'ar space, while Apocalypse took 7 others to Asteroid K. And trust me guys, I know it's a lot to take in, and that's why I'm repeating a lot of this going through the playlist, and not just for you guys, but for myself as well. But if need be, you can play this back as many times as you like, because the narrative eventually builds on top of it. But on Asteroid K, where the population was total 8 people, it was 4 years after this establishment when Moira turned 104, when her and Apocalypse formulated a plan in order to stop Nimrod. But 3 years after that, a Black Brain Hound had attempted an assassination on Apocalypse, which left Moira injured at age 107, and as a result she had to be placed in stasis. And if I had to guess, Moira likely risked her life to save Apocalypse, likely because they were together. But we'll see. But with Wolverine returning here and giving Moira the crystal that contained the data of Nimrod's origin and creation, which Apocalypse had designed this quicker form of with delivery so she could obtain all this information as quickly as possible, but after doing so, Wolverine has to kill Moira in order to send her into lifetime number 10, so that when she arrives, she can actually implement all the data that they had taken and everything she had learned along the way, and carry all of that information over into the next lifetime, to where she would this time in the 10th lifetime go to Charles Xavier first and show him everything, which is crazy because I joked around like on Instagram, because in her 9th lifetime when she meets Apocalypse first, like the first thing they go and do is they kill Charles and they kill Magneto. So now going into her 10th life, when she meets Charles and Charles looks into her mind, he of course sees all of that, and this kicks off the timeline which begins House of X, which starts off with Charles Xavier meeting a complete stranger who's like, oh yeah, in the previous life we were married and then I got a chance to do it all over again, but instead I met somebody else and we killed you, but I'm back again just to see if we can work things out, which is ridiculous, but it's weird how that feels so familiar for some reason. Alright, so thus far throughout the course of House of X and Powers of 10, we've been shown the level of importance that there is to data and information through a number of data heists, with it literally meaning life and death to the mutants. And for that reason, more importantly, they've had to have a level of secrecy because the leaking of this information could very well mean their own extinction. And so here in Moira's 10th lifetime, the stakes are higher than ever. And we know this because back in her 3rd life, when she had received her warning from the Brotherhood of Mutants and Destiny, who let her know that she has 10 lives, maybe 11, it put Moira in this position to where in this 10th life it has to work because there's no guarantee that she'll come back after. And with her coming into this life with literally hundreds of years of experience, and bringing with her from her 9th life the origin of Nimrod and his confidential files on his creation. But with doing so and bringing all that information into her 10th life, if the humans were able to see any of that, not only would they panic and attack Krakoa, but this could also speed up their technological advances against the mutant race. And so now previously we had talked about the more recent data heists from Damage Control, and so now in this case it wasn't necessarily like your 9th lifetime where Moira was trying to take information into the next life, and even within that 9th lifetime it wasn't until Moira was 104 years old till her and Apocalypse came up with that plan together. But it's here within her 10th life where the mutants are doing a heist mainly to keep tabs on the technology that the humans have access to. But with doing so, we had seen that there had been friction with the Fantastic Four, with Sabretooth getting caught and Cyclops not necessarily being able to press his hand to get them to let him go. But with a lot of indirect suggestions, he did kind of give them a wink through conversation, and not like a literal wink, which kind of makes me think like if Cyclops winked, like will one side of his visor go dark? I don't know. One of you guys let me know what you think in the comments. But more or less when Cyclops let them take Sabretooth, he let them know that Sabretooth is a citizen of Krakoa, which is where he should be on trial, because we take care of our own and your son may need a seat that we're saving for him someday. And in the case of Sabretooth, we see this actually come into play, because at this point when he's taken into the court of supervillain processing, we're given an example of how the laws change, not just for mutants but for anyone with powers. And more specifically, we see with Sabretooth having to go through the 12 strike rule, which applied to him about 11,000 strikes ago. But with the 12 strike rule exceeding intentions and more or less judging you guilty for just your actions, this gives his court appointed attorney a hard time, because at this point forget what you went to school for, because the humans have also evolved the law to work in their favor. So in this case, had this been someone like your Franklin Richards, you can only imagine through the course of a stretched out trial what laws they would have made up to attempt to imprison him. So it's like when we see Sabretooth here, he's more of the example of the temperature of this quote supervillain legal system, because at the end of the day, if you have powers and they call you a villain, then they're going to justify whatever prosecution they like under the new laws. And Sabretooth even understands that, and he speaks pretty loosely to the extent of letting these guys know that if he wanted to go Coming to America style with these guys' intestines, that by all means he could, because once again this is Sabretooth, he has done worse with even less of a reason to do so. But when Emma Frost arrives here, along with Esme and Sophie, she comes to bring Sabretooth back to Krakoa under the laws of extradition, much like Cyclops had mentioned earlier, and she does so without using her mutant powers, no telepathy, but simply countering the law with the law. And really either one of them, whether Sabretooth or Emma Frost, they could have gotten Sabretooth out of here, whether on his own or her bringing him out. But if they were to escalate such a situation in a courtroom, because in return it would only agitate the humans' response to a mutant threat. But upon leaving, when Emma Frost tells the prosecutor like where she can make her place that gun if she so desired, it goes to show you just the gravity of what Emma Frost is willing to protect in spite of what she wanted to do in this moment. And much like Sabretooth not tearing these dudes apart, this is also a huge moment for Emma Frost, because like we had talked about back during Secret Empire, during X-Men Blue, where the population was pretty much split between the mutants, and she just decided to take the younger, time-displaced Cyclops to herself, there was nothing he could do about it. So to see her walk out of this courtroom without the slightest move on anybody, it shows a great deal of restraint for her character. But where this all comes into play for like Emma Frost, the White Queen, and also Sabretooth turning the other cheek in situations where they wouldn't necessarily do so, and for reasons like I mentioned earlier with the mutants hiding what's going on with Krakoa, with them having the critical information which was given to them from Moira McTaggart, which is also why they recognized Nimrod from the files that they had taken from Damage Control, and also with them protecting the multiple lifetime reconnaissance of Moira McTaggart. They are constantly on the hunt for information within this current lifetime. With this possibly being the last chance, they have the dire need to know how close are the humans to building Nimrod. And so when it comes to the point that they discover the plans for Nimrod actually exist in the possession of the humans, they have to destroy it even if it's a suicide mission. And I like the transparency of Cyclops, who has not only prepared himself mentally but also his team. And though you would think on the side of Professor X and Magneto that it's easy for them to stay behind and say, well, go ahead and do it, on the contrary, we have seen both of them give their lives to either save or protect the mutant race in the previous lifetimes of Moira McTaggart. But when we see Cyclops go to this team that he's assembled to make their way to the Mother Mold, he also informs them that they're not taking any Krakoan plants because of the risk of it compromising any of the intel they've achieved or even their strategies. And initially when he does this, of course there are objections, but it also works as an incentive to not fail because they don't have the plants as an easy failsafe to fall back on, which means they have to stay super sharp with no room for error. But before we move forward, just to dig a little bit deeper into their level of secrecy with us knowing what's at stake, I wanted to talk a bit about the language of Krakoa, because since they made Krakoa their province, their home, their country, and when they began to use the plants that we talked about in the previous video, which would allow the mutants to travel to Krakoa from virtually any location, upon every mutant's first trip, a resident telepath will imprint a Krakoan language which is exclusive to the mutants, so that after they've arrived for the first time, they're able to read, write, and speak this language, which is not only useful for like mutant amber alerts, but it's also helped them to keep what they've known to themselves, which is super critical, because if the humans had the slightest inkling of what Moira McTaggart has seen, not only would they panic, but they would speed up production and likely achieve within months what would have taken them decades. And so now this new language, it was created by Douglas Ramsey, who's also known as Cypher, because prior to this point, he was the only person who can understand Krakoa and communicate back and forth successfully in the original Krakoan language. And in Moira's previous life, her 9th lifetime, we had seen eventually that Cypher had made a symbiotic bond with Krakoa, either as a result of his death, likely because of the betrayal event, or he eventually just died, with his physical body not lasting as long as his Krakoan counterpart. But as far as where we stand in this 10th lifetime of Moira McTaggart, it's a long ways before that even happening. Given this circumstance, the history repeats itself at all to an extent. But with this language that Cypher created, it is very likely that this is also the encryption to much of their highly classified information. So if this information was leaked and the humans had access to it, this would then give them access to learning everything that Moira McTaggart had discovered previously and brought to this timeline. But it's for these reasons that they attempt to minimize any compromise of this information. But with them setting their course tens of millions of miles away to this Mother Mold station orbiting much closer to the sun, and upon their arrival, even though they made it seem as if they were coming from the dark side of Venus, but when they closed in on the station, it was undeniable who they were, and because of this, they could make a pretty good guess of what they were there for. But their element of surprise had a very short window, which they had used for Nightcrawler to pretty much go in and gain reconnaissance, so they could confirm where everyone was going before entering the ship. And part of their plan here, of course, is to avoid as many human casualties as possible, eliminate the threat, and get out of there. But what's crazy is when they arrive and Nightcrawler's just jumping from space to space, and more or less following the schematic that they already have, but eventually he bumps into Dr. Gregor and Karima, to where at this time they've already called back in the Sentinels, which were stationed on Mercury, mining minerals this whole time, which is another factor which left their defenses so light. But at this point, Orchis has already suspected that their arrival will be too late, and at this point, Dr. Gregor's husband, Erasmus, who's watched Nightcrawler's point-to-point teleportation, and at this point he has a fairly good idea of where the rest of the mutants are going to dock their ship, with him recognizing Nightcrawler's move as more of a scout. But even with his experience, he believes that the mutants had planned this out too well, and even to a point of much suspicion. And I mean, he's not wrong, with Nightcrawler knowing the exact places to check and their ship landing at the exact place that they needed to land. And because of this, in desperation, in hopes to stop the mutants before they enter the hull, which will give them access to the entire station, he blows himself up and a portion of the X-Men ship in an attempt to stop the X-Men from pursuing their plan, which has been going perfect so far. But that'll do it for this one, guys. In this one, I really wanted to kind of focus on why the stakes are so high, mainly because of the decision of Cyclops to not bring any Krakoa implants, because with doing so, the whole factor of risking their lives to get it done, it would just leave room for hesitation, and that we'll get into much deeper when we jump back in. But until then, keep your eyes open for these symbols of Krakoa because they all have a translation any and every time that we see them. Alright, so in the last video where we had talked about the secret language of Krakoa, which as of issue 3 we now know how to understand that dialect, or at least how to read it, because it is a spoken language as well, which I would like to hear someday, which would really just take it to the next level. But with us getting into everything that the mutants have to lose, here in this 10th lifetime of Moira McTaggart, this really set the stakes of why they went in without a backup plan, because failure was not an option, and actually making it out alive sat very low on the totem pole of priorities. And this kind of feeds into a theory that I have as far as Moira McTaggart and her mutant power somehow being synthesized with Krakoa in order to blow our minds one more time. But we'll get to that in a little bit. But as far as us seeing how this went down, like the plan was going perfect up until Dr. Gregor's husband sacrificed his life in an attempt to kill the X-Men, with them choosing the perfect point of entry, which would have given them access to the whole station. And so from here we jump over to the observation portion of Krakoa, to where the 8 of them here can merge their minds together so they can communicate with Jean Grey and the others on the mission. And it's pretty crazy how this works with all of them working together, with Beast running analytics and the Cuckoo sisters telepathically bonding everyone else, including Trinary, who we had seen before in X-Men Red, and doing so in a way that appears to only connect Magneto through this aquagraphic display that Storm is making while they're connected to Jean Grey. And it's pretty insane, and the only reason that I say that it's likely that Magneto's not directly connected is because, one, he's still got his helmet on, but also that would be a pretty clever failsafe if this connection had compromised the others somehow, some way. But when they connect with Jean, she lets them know off the rip it is looking bad, and she lets Charles know, like, Archangel and Husk, they dead. Nightcrawler's bleeding internally, I don't know how long he got, and I'm looking at Wolverine's bones right now. So in other words, he okay. Like, she's telling them the full details. And as far as Magneto, who is connected somehow, I don't understand. But when he asks if they can complete the mission, Cyclops' response is more or less like, yo, I'm the Tom Brady of the X-Men, we getting this done. And from here, Cyclops, who calls the play of who needs to go where, he gets Nightcrawler to drop everyone off at their locations with their instructions. And I ain't gonna front, I would have looked at Nightcrawler like, yo, Kurt. Yeah, I said Kurt, you Kurt today. But I would have asked him, like, before you bamf me in there, like, you sure you are right? I need you to walk in a straight line, follow my fingers. Like, I would have gave him the old sobriety test, because I need to be sure that he knows what all is his and what's all is mine's, because the last thing I want is to pop up over there with a tail swinging around. Or even worse, he show up without me and leave me in the middle, like in the Brimstone dimension or something. But once they made their way in, we jump over to Dr. Gregor, to whom at this point is understandably traumatized with her husband committing suicide in the belief of saving her work and saving the human race. But at this point, Karima, she tells Dr. Gregor that she needs to get up and make her husband's death count for something, which are pretty cold words, but if you try to step into the perception of what their objective is with preserving the Dyson Sphere, or at least buying enough time for the Sentinel army to make their way back, to do it for them, either or, but this speech pushes Dr. Gregor into that mode to where she'll do whatever it takes to make her husband's death mean the most to everything that they've been working on, because once again, from their perspective, he died a heroic death, and Dr. Gregor's gonna do absolutely everything she can to honor that, and perhaps with a little bit of revenge here and there, a little sprinkle on the side. But immediately after this, she begins to assist Captain Moore, who has taken her husband's place as head of station security, but not long after, Section 4 and Section 2 are taken out by Wolverine and Nightcrawler, which is good because they're halfway done, but it's also bad because all the help is going to one side, all the defenses, all the guns are going to one side, to where we go over to 1 and 2, which are mainly left to Cyclops and Mystique to split up and each take one down. But while this is happening and Jean's communicating with Charles and the others, Monet has to leave Jean in order to fight off the soldiers coming for her, giving Jean the chance to get away. And even though she's very much a wrecking machine on her own, with her strength and speed and dense skin tissue, to where she could easily cut through dozens of these guys, but there are so many coming her way that she faces them on her own, ejecting Jean from the station, and from there just taking out as many guards as she can. But from here, when we jump over to the remaining control callers, both 1 and 3, with Cyclops at 1 and Mystique at 3, he's able to make his way through and successfully disengage. But in the case of Mystique, her directions are to disguise herself and make her way in, and after doing so, also manually disengage. But when she arrives here, she's quickly discovered by Dr. Gregor, who just opens a hatch and sends her flying into space. And Dr. Gregor does this with Mystique literally like 2 steps away from the lever. But with doing so, it's from here that Dr. Gregor sends Mother Mold online, and at this point very prematurely, and mainly because Mother Mold at this point could very well be incapable of determining the threat which it was designed to eliminate, and it could very likely group human humans and mutants both in the same category. But when she activates the boot sequence for the mother mode, you can hear this throughout the entire station. And this lets the remaining X-Men know, and I mean all the way back to Charles and the others, that this is fourth quarter, clock's running, no timeouts, with 20 seconds left, or everything that we've gathered and done to this point is worth nothing. And when Charles tells them that they should continue, and you can tell it's killing him to even say that. And Magneto, on the other hand, we don't really see his response, but I could take a guess at what it would be. But it's here where I gotta tell you, man, like when I first read this, like when it came to the part where Cyclops heard this and Jean asked if he was clear, if he was there, like I'm telling you, in my mind, I could hear Scott's fist hitting that glass in frustration, in fear, and that hollow thump just crescendo through the pain of him losing his team, his family, all in the matter of minutes, and at this point only having 11 seconds to make it all worth it. But through that mental link, when Wolverine and Nightcrawler tell Cyclops that they can do it, and just seconds before going out there, Wolverine asks Kurt if he believes that there's something on the other side, truly waiting for the two of them after this life ends, which is something I hope to see in issue 5 or 6, and I'll tell you guys why in just a minute. But with these quick few words between the two of them, it's just beautiful to hear from Wolverine, who's like the toughest there is. And in my opinion, if there is anybody he would have this conversation with, I am very glad that it was Nightcrawler, because for many years he's always had this element of spirituality, which has always made him that unique member of the X-Men family that they could talk to, especially Wolverine, who would also in many times comfort Kurt, who initially had insecurities about his appearance. And because of this, to see the two of them here just have this quick conversation, it's like one of those perfect examples of those teams to where you have your select members here and there who share a history like they really connected, like a real family. And so when they head out there to take down the last control collar on this station, which reminds you is so close to the sun, Nightcrawler is immediately incinerated within seconds. And as far as Wolverine, who has to act quickly because the only thing buying him time are his adamantium bones and his healing factor, which most would think is great because hey, he gets to live a little longer. But on the contrary, the way I see it, it's like he dies a lot slower. But while he's out there, he's able to destroy the last control collar, sending the mother mode head diving into the sun, with gravity just pretty much taking over from there. And him, of course, going shortly after. And I gotta tell you right now, like when it comes to epic Wolverine moments, like anytime you've ever seen Wolverine taking down a Sentinel, like ever, like as many iconic images as there are of Wolverine fighting Sentinels, this is now the new creme de la creme. And there's a lot of cool imagery and even fan art. Like as of right now, the standard has been lifted. But at this point, with Cyclops realizing that they're done here, he confirms the professor is updated and he's figured out a way to make his way to Jean, and from there use his powers to push them to an escape vector, and then he's shot in the back by Karima, who with doing so has injected him with a payload of nanites which stop his mutant powers from working. And very likely something similar to what we've seen disable Wolverine's healing factor, but in this case disabling his optic blast, leaving him to Dr. Gregor, who executes him on the spot. And at this point with Jean Grey, who's been drifting in an escape pod, she's intercepted here by the Sentinels, who have arrived back from the Mercury mines as they savagely tear her pod apart. And man, it is heavy. Like in my mind, I'm thinking one, like Charles need to stop doing anything that has to do with teams in Krakoa, and it's possible that this happening could have reminded him of Deadly Genesis if that actually played out in one of Moira's previous lives when he first sent a team of X-Men to Krakoa to where he had thought all of them had been killed. But also with this happening, I can't help but think of some of the things that we've seen in House of X issue number 1 that we weren't given much of an explanation to, but at the time when we had seen them, and what appeared to be a location that looked very similar to the breeding pits on Mars, which were originally designed by Mr. Sinister. And in these images, we see what I believe to be your Generation 1 manufactured mutants, if you will. And I got a link down in the description to my Sinister Betrayal video that'll better explain how these pits work, and how the first generation were exact copies of specific mutants, and other generations would then combine different mutants to produce different results. And my theory is that it's possible, just possible, that Charles Xavier used this method in order to send out a team of your Generation 1 mutants, and doing so sending these mutants out to fight, knowing that they would operate and execute every order just like their original counterpart would. And that's just my afterthought, my theory. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below, because personally I just think that would be like a crazy twist. And at this point, it is truly what I'm hoping to see down the line, because this would mean that Charles and the X-Men are truly using all the information that Moira McTaggart had given them and made it work to their ultimate advantage. Alright, so jumping right into it, and one thing that I feel like is super important, or at least stood out to me, that we had seen taking place with Moira McTaggart in year 1 of this 10th life, and that was the point when she initially approached Charles Xavier, and at some point after showing him all the lives that she had lived through, she had also mentioned that this time we're going to have to break all the rules. And finally in Powers of 10 issue number 4, her saying that is beginning to make sense, because after her meeting with Charles and then both of them going to see Magneto, both Xavier and Magneto go to meet Mr. Sinister. And it's not necessarily who they're meeting in this case, but it's what they do when they meet him. But before we get to that, another thing that's pretty important is that when we arrive here on Sinister's island, which is called Bar Sinister, which is very much a callback to Secret Wars, when Dr. Doom assigned Mr. Sinister as Baron over Sinister's particular region. And aside from that, it also reminds me a bit of the Desolation Islands, which we had seen before, were the islands where Mr. Sinister had did his research. But we'll get more into that shortly. But so when Xavier and Magneto arrive here, they bump into a first Mr. Sinister who's not quite Mr. Sinister. So as a result, Magneto gives him a bit of motivation to introduce them to the real actual Mr. Sinister, who in my opinion are one of the most important people needed to make this work. And so when they approach this next Mr. Sinister, they begin to inform him that they're aware on his work in genetics, with Sinister of course having a history of collecting and studying both human and mutant genetics. But when they come here, they tell him they want him to focus mainly on the mutants, and they'll even provide him with more DNA, including their own, with the addition of other mutants who may be hard to catch or sample from. And so real quick, with the addition of Bar Sinister being very reminiscent of Secret Wars, but the island along with this conversation also remind me a bit of what we had seen in The Hunt for Wolverine. And of course, time-wise, if The Hunt for Wolverine still plays a factor like at all with everything that Hickman is doing, then the events of year 1 would have then of course taken place decades before. But in year 0, when Charles and Magneto visit the island of Bar Sinister, and they express that they're aware of Sinister's studies with genetics within humans and mutants, it really sounds like Sinister was still within the early stages of what we had found on the Desolation Islands in The Hunt for Wolverine, where Sinister had eventually nearly collected the DNA of every man, woman, and child on the planet. But it's with proposing this idea that both Xavier and Magneto are harshly rejected. And immediately after, this Sinister is shot in the head and we're met with the real Mr. Sinister, who at this point now has a mutant gene. And so now we've talked about the origin of Mr. Sinister a number of times before, to where in a nutshell, Apocalypse made him enhanced and extended his lifespan so he could continue his studies, and Sinister has made his own modifications from there. And although up front he only admits to Charles and Magneto that he has a mutant gene, we later find out through the news and gossip of Bar Sinister, which has kindly been given to us from Jonathan Hickman. But it's there that we find out that one of Sinister's secrets is that he had taken this gene from John Proudstar, aka Thunderbird. But with Sinister finally revealing himself and unshamingly being flattered with Xavier and Magneto wanting to meet him and solicit his cooperation, it's here with Charles Xavier where we begin to see what Moira was talking about with breaking all the rules, because it's in this moment that Charles Xavier pushes Mr. Sinister to refocus his studies towards mutants, and only mutants, so that this way he would be ridiculously meticulous with it. But with doing so, Xavier also wiped his mind so he would forget that Xavier and Magneto showed up on this day. But instead, Sinister would just think that this was a thought of his own, and moving forward he would not remember this encounter unless Charles wanted him to. And so now for Charles Xavier, for the history that we've known him prior to Powers of 10 or House of X, there may have been a time or two where he's used his powers in this way to suppress people's memories, or perhaps make them forget entire teams that he's put together, much like Deadly Genesis, where Vulcan came back and forced him to face the truth. Which all in all, in the Hickman run, in my opinion, it makes it more believable that Charles Xavier at this point in his life would actually do this if at this time he believed it was the only way to save the mutant race. Magneto on the other hand, given Charles's powers, like, he wouldn't bat an eye, and we've already seen in Moira's previous life how far he would go just using the powers that he has, even if it meant turning the world upside down. Figuratively, like we've seen him prove numerous times that he'll do whatever he believes that it takes. But aside from the breaking the rules aspect, the reason why Mr. Sinister is so important is mainly based off the betrayal event that we had talked about previously on this playlist, and I got a link down in the description below. But it was throughout this betrayal event where we had the 4 generations that came from Mr. Sinister, which both created mutants who were carbon copies of their original selves, which for the record I am hoping are the ones who went on that mother mode, but we not finna go there right now. But they would create mutants which were carbon copies of themselves, for military purposes, which were designed after the Sentinel Hound program. But with Xavier and Magneto visiting Mr. Sinister much earlier than when this would have started in Moira's other life, this now gives Charles the opportunity to get ahead of the betrayal event actually playing out the way that it did when Sinister sabotaged these mutants to the point of where the 4th generation nearly annihilated the mutant race. But with your previous generations with like your 1-to-1 carbon copies, for the mutants to have a chance for the things coming ahead, it's very much important that they still exist. But this time around we're seeing Xavier, who's sparking this controlled incident, which also gave us other mutants like Rasputin, who has 5 mutant genes, and also Cardinal, who is more of your passive type, but even still with this idea given to Sinister, essentially resparking their creation within this timeline. But in this case, with what Charles Xavier knows, it gives him the chance to prevent the actual betrayal event before the 4th generation, which is the one that destroyed everything. But from here, jumping forward to year 10, it's here where we see Charles Xavier take Douglas Ramsey to Krakoa for the first time. And the timing of Charles doing this now and not earlier likely has to play in with certain factors like Douglas Ramsey coming of age, discovering his mutant power, and knowing how to use it to an extent before bringing him here. But also with doing so, he tells him very straightforward that he needs Douglas's gift to decipher any language so that he can communicate with Krakoa better than Charles can. Because even with the telepathy of Charles prior to bringing Cypher here, his communication with Krakoa sounded very much like a broken English, because Charles could likely pick up simple patterns, but because of this, Charles would be stuck with the limitation by himself with making conversation like Charles's friend, Island is friend. And for this reason, he very much needed Cypher here not only to communicate with Krakoa, but with doing so, eventually build a language to which Charles or any other telepath could then just transfer to other mutants and bridge that overall gap of communication. But while Douglas Ramsey, aka Cypher, is here, and Charles is asking him to get more acquainted with Krakoa, to where at this moment all Charles can understand from Krakoa is sad. But it's here where we're given just a slight example of what Charles would hear Krakoa say with his telepathy versus what Cypher would hear via translation. Because Cypher tells Charles, after briefly speaking with Krakoa, that one, yes, Krakoa is sad, but it's much deeper than that. Because thousands of years ago, Krakoa was once known as Okara, but upon the arrival of these dark beings, Okara was then separated into Krakoa and Arako, which from that time has left Krakoa incomplete. But these dark beings who had did this when they arrived, they had also come wielding the Twilight Sword, and as far as who they are, we really don't know at this point. And in the case of this being the Twilight Sword, which was created by Surtur, it's possible that this may be the case, but still at this point it's a bit of a stretch. And I mainly say that because through the years we've seen slight variations to the Twilight Sword, to where most of them have kept their broadsword, jeweled, gold type of shape and color depiction. But there's also been instances with the Twilight Sword, which you have known to been associated with Surtur, to have some of a resemblance to this sword that we've seen. And because a number of people have wielded the Twilight Sword, we can very well be looking at someone using Surtur's sword, or an entire different entity who has created their own Twilight Sword much like Surtur, but with different powers and different capabilities, but perhaps in this case something more similar to Ilyana Rasputin, who created her soul sword while in limbo. And man, we haven't talked about that since the New Mutants movie was announced, and I mean before it got pushed back the first time. But thousands of years ago when these dark beings arrived, Earth's hero was actually Apocalypse, savior of the world, but it was him who had pushed them back through the doorway which they had came through, along with Arako. And with doing so, Apocalypse gave up his horsemen for them to stand guard on the other side to make sure that that door stayed shut. But after seeing this and further speaking with Xavier, Cypher understood that Xavier had a larger plan, of which Xavier shared with Cypher through his telepathy, and you've got to imagine like it is a lot. But for Cypher, who was already on board, it really just convinced him the more how much this needed to be done. And it's from here where Cypher began to build on top of his communication with Krakoa, to where he would eventually develop a language which the mutants could use so that it could be implemented in a similar fashion of how it was used in Moira's previous lifetimes. But I also gotta say this, like with Charles showing Cypher the plans he had for him and Krakoa, I'm pretty sure he left out certain details from Moira's previous lives, like in the 9th life when he then merged with Krakoa sometime in the future after the betrayal event, which I believe was a result of him being mortally wounded and the remains of Krakoa bonding with him to what would eventually just be a corpse. But I'm pretty sure Charles left all that out. But that'll do it for this one, guys. I finally feel like at this point we can start to get into year 1000 and the Ascension, which I would much rather do all in one video, mainly because Hickman has so much going on, and for that reason, much like the betrayal event, I don't want to brush over it, but rather take the time to kick it off and kind of sort out all the information we've gathered of it so far. At this point, we're shown the aftermath of that mission where the X-Men took down the Mother Mold, which is a mission that cost them their lives. And at the time when we talked about this, I made a prediction towards the end of that video, and it was really more of a hypothesis than a prediction because Hickman set this up very well. And what we come to find out when we get back to Krakoa, and Hickman uses Lorna Dane, Magneto's daughter, more or less as the eyes and ears of the reader to inform us of what's happening here, because Magneto shows her that with what they're doing here at Krakoa, once it's fully set in place, it'll be the first time that the mutants have ever had like stability. And he uses the great analogy like with humans, like before they were migrators and hunters and gatherers, but that all changed once they learned agriculture, like the ability to plant and grow what keeps you alive instead of chasing it around all the time. And once you're stable in one spot, then you can grow your society, which is essentially what Krakoa is for the mutants. And so now within this, like the biggest thing that we're given the explanation of as far as this 10th lifetime and how the mutants are preserving their race, this comes to us by a group that Charles has put together called the Five. And so keep in mind, if you guys already seen the Sinister Betrayal video where I talked about Moira's previous life and how the mutant population had dropped tremendously, and within that previous life, Sinister was appointed to create more mutants. And that is exactly why here in Moira's 10th life, Charles Xavier pushed Mr. Sinister beyond his will to focus only on the mutant gene, and with doing so in this life, Sinister will repeat his past behavior, but this time only under the controlled supervision of Charles Xavier. And mainly because with Sinister left to his own devices, as we know, this once again led to the near destruction of the entire mutant race. And in this 10th lifetime, that's the part that they don't want to repeat. But what they've taken from Sinister's previous plan, to where we talked about it brought forth 4 different generations of mutants, at this point in time we're only seeing the implementation of generation 1, and that is the purpose of the Five. Because much like how the Sinister from Moira's previous life, in his first generation of manufactured mutants, they came out as 1-to-1 copies of the mutants they were harvested from, we find out with the Five in this 10th life the way that the X-Men are choosing to accomplish this. And amongst the Five, where you have Fabio Medina, who creates like these gold balls, which is something he's been doing, but come to find out, these were actually eggs produced of biological matter. And there's no limit to how many Fabio could make. And with using reality warping from Proteus to ready these eggs for fertilization, to where Hope would insert the DNA of whichever mutant they wanted to grow, and Elixir would kind of guide the process of cellular replication. And all the while with this is happening, Hope is using her abilities to keep them all in sync, so that each one of these steps are all performed in harmony as if one organism was producing it. And the more that they do this, they don't necessarily build fatigue, but rather they get better at it and their harmony syncs tighter, making this whole process more efficient each time. And so with doing this, they're able to reproduce the physical body of any mutant that they have a DNA sample of. And along with this, they've made certain rules, like not to make additional copies of other mutants unless their death has been confirmed or they've been missing from Cerebro for at least 30 days. And so now once again, this process is really a copy of Sinister's Generation 1, and the mutants being produced here, they're only exact copies of their sample. And we're told at this point that the X-Men are considering reproducing like your Generation 2 and 3, which essentially combine different mutant powers into one mutant, but at this point the only augment that they're doing is the speeding up of age to the optimal point of performance for that particular mutant, which is essentially like your most important augment, so you're not like raising all of these guys from babies all the way to adulthood and waiting for their mutant powers to manifest. And at the rate that they're doing this, they can produce about 1,000 mutants in a week and up to 200 mutants a day. And though they've been discussing ideas like using mutants like Mimic to speed up the process, I'd have to say like Generation 3 is the answer, because if you guys remember, like we talked about, Generation 3 mutants can hold up to 5 powers, which would then consolidate the use of the 5, place them all into one person, and then this one mutant could just produce mutants. And you could even go as far to make multiple single 5-powered mutants. But that's not to your 3rd generation, so let me not get ahead of myself. But with using this 1st generation process, Charles Xavier pretty much reproduces the X-Men who had died on that mission destroying the Mother Mold. And just for the record, when we see this here in issue 5 of House of X, this isn't the first time that this is happening, but it's the first time that we're seeing it. And proof of that is just the fact that Charles Xavier is walking, when in year 1 he clearly wasn't. But so now, as far as the next step after these mutants are produced, Xavier uses Cerebro, which we find out has not only been tracking mutants but also copying them so that they can be uploaded into these new bodies. This is the way that Charles restores their memories so that they can more or less pick up where they left off. So with this, after Eva Bell matured them to their rightful age, Charles would then upload the latest backup of their memories, and this backup of their minds would be updated every week. So at the worst, they would be missing about a week of memories. But so with doing this and bringing back the X-Men who gave their lives to save the rest of the mutants at Genosha, of which they're only a fraction of the 100,000 mutants who are left on the planet Earth, and even at this rate of bringing them back, which is like 1,000 mutants a week, this is only a drop in comparison to the 16 million who are lost in Genosha, which are mutants that they do plan to eventually restore, but in the meantime they need to campaign and feed the hope of the mutants who are here until they get to that point. And so with doing so, with the people of Krakoa gathered around, Storm goes to each of the X-Men and she confirms that they are who they are. And with each one, she asks them, what is your name? And they tell her their name. And after that, she asks them, and how do I know it's you, either a brother or sister? And they would answer back in a way that only that particular mutant would answer. And in my mind, I couldn't help but think, like, what if she walked up to one of them like Wolverine and was like, who wrote Uncanny X-Men issue 109? And he was like, and she's just like, what? Lightning, boom, and just shocks him out of there. Now that would have been crazy, but more or less, this is just something for the people to appear that there's nothing to hide and resurge their confidence in their leaders. And ultimately in this 10th life, one of the biggest goals in this plan is to restore the people of Genosha, the entire 16 million, which weighs heavy on Magneto's heart. And even in this moment, because of that, he even admits that it makes it hard for him to celebrate. And so now jumping forward to the next day after this, we make our way over to the United Nations, to where we come to find out that Krakoa is officially a nation. And in this case, once again, breaking all the rules, Emma Frost made sure that the votes were tipped in their favor, but not doing so in the obvious way, like they left Russia, Brazil, and they left Wakanda alone, but they definitely pushed the influence to make sure that this happened, with it being crucial to their survival. And to kind of dress it up and not make it as obvious, they left out certain countries like Latveria, Russia, Brazil, and Wakanda, like I mentioned. And the funny thing with Wakanda, like the way that it's set out, like it says with each country like why they declined to do so. And with Wakanda, instead of saying their reason was political or ideological, like their answer was, we do not need mutant drugs. And that's what I'm talking about, Wakanda, just say no. But as you guys know, that just pours back into the human drugs for Krakoa, or from Krakoa, that we had seen before, which were offered to the government back in the earlier issues. But after this is done, habitation to the rest of the world, as far as all the mutants which are spread around, they have now been openly invited to make their way to Krakoa. And this means like everybody. Like this invitation is open to all 100,000 of them. And with doing this, we're given the arrival of Apocalypse. And also I gotta say, it's pretty cool seeing Doc in here in the back too, the son of Wolverine. Like it's been a minute. Hopefully James Hudson Jr. will pop up somewhere. But then again, he might be an absolute carnage, being that he still has a symbiote right now. But either way, Apocalypse, who is no stranger to Krakoa like Hickman has showed us recently. But when he arrives here, and there's like this brief awkward moment where Magneto and Wolverine, they tell Apocalypse like, if you're going to be here, then you need to abide by the Krakoan rules. And Apocalypse more or less tells him like, look, I've been trying to get y'all to do this. And he tells them more or less like this is the manifestation of them fulfilling the role that he's been wanting them to fulfill, which is very consistent to who Apocalypse is, because that has always been his agenda as long as we've known him. Granted, in past tellings, we've seen him go about it different ways, but at the end of the day, this is just a reflection of what he always wanted. And Magneto's so gangster, y'all. Like he just comes out like, okay, I need to hear you say the words though, of which Apocalypse does oblige, and he tells them that they are one people from this day forward. And from there, Apocalypse and Charles, they shake hands, which is something I thought I would never see. But even with doing so, like, okay, so you know Apocalypse can change to like any size. But what I don't understand is like, dude, if you can change size to size and we seeing eye to eye, why I'm still looking up at you right now? Like if we shaking hands, show me that we shaking hands, like come down a little bit, bruh. And Apocalypse is more so just looking like, you know, we shaking hands, but just know that I'm still Apocalypse. But that'll do it for this one, guys. But last thing real quick, just something I was thinking, as far as reproducing the different X-Men like 1-to-1 in this first generation, like when it comes down to Wolverine and him still having adamantium bones, which is just something that I thought about. Like Hickman hasn't even gone there or anything like that, but I would go to assume that possibly Magneto or, you know, Polaris or somebody probably handled that part after his age was like fast forward to like peak condition, which for Wolverine was probably like 90 years old. Alright, so previously in our other playlist where we had talked about the events unfolding in House of X, we eventually discovered how Charles Xavier was using the 5 to genetically replicate your physical host of any mutant that he had a sample of. But this process that we had seen, which takes place well into year 10, it only produced a shell which they call the host, which they could only manipulate by aging the host however old they would desire them to be, which was preferably after an age where their mutant powers had developed. But in order to get these hosts a soul, like we talked about in the previous video, Charles Xavier Xavier will have to upload their memories into these host bodies from this newer version of Cerebro. And so now in Powers of 10, where we start back again with year 1, but just a little bit further along, from Charles meeting Moira, learning about her previous lives, then taking that and sharing that truth with Magneto, and then after that, Charles leaving with Magneto and making Mr. Sinister bring forth discoveries that he eventually would according to Moira's previous lifetimes. But when Charles and Magneto met Mr. Sinister, Charles gave him a bit of a nudge in order to make it happen sooner. And so now in Powers of X, where we see Charles Xavier speaking the Forge and more or less asking him to upgrade Cerebro, this is something that was supposed to eventually happen throughout your traditional history of Cerebro, which almost makes it feel like Jonathan Hickman is nudging us with the idea that what we had seen take place when Charles originally asked Forge to update Cerebro, that this had happened in one of Moira's previous lifetimes, which is likely where Charles got this idea, but this time around in the 10th life and once again breaking all the rules. And with this time around when Charles meets with Forge, which I also think is a little bit earlier than it should have been, but this time around when Charles meets with Forge, he proposes the idea of Cerebro not only being able to track down every mutant, but also back up their minds and essentially back up a sentient being. And this is something that we knew about before within Powers of 10 and House of X, with us first learning about the Sinister Betrayal event, and then more recently in Moira's 10th life, we've seen Charles kind of copy that in order to produce a very similar result, but this time around using the 5 in order to do so. But the thing is, when Charles initially brings this idea to Forge, initially he thinks it's ridiculous, but he then mentions to Charles that there's two problems with this concept, with one being redundancy, and mainly because over the years people change, and not just mentally but sometimes because of circumstances physically as well. And with Forge suggesting this is why when we get to year 10, when all of this is placed into action and the rules are created like we talked about in the last video, when to duplicate and when not to, this is why Cerebro was set to back up everyone's mind once a week, and this is why they had the need for redundancy. But also with this issue, Forge mentions that you have the population of mutants growing every year, to where at this time it's prior to the incident in Genosha when millions of mutants lost their lives, and at this time Forge knows nothing about this, but he's just running back at Charles some of the logistics of how big this request truly is, which brings up the next issue, which happens to be the fact that there is no hard drive on this planet that is big enough to hold that amount of data, and especially with Charles saying that whatever that amount is, that he needs that times 5. And at this point Forge just takes a sip like, yeah, oh, okay. And I could just imagine like in his mind he's like, well can we figure out one first? Because once again he let Charles know that there's not a hard drive that big on this planet, but at this point Charles has already figured out that this could be resolved with the help of the Shi'ar. And so now later on, eventually we'll see that this will be done with the use of Shi'ar logic diamonds, because later on towards year 10, when this process is fully functional and the rules are set in place and Charles Xavier is doing his weekly backups of all the mutants, in addition to that, once a year he'll dump off all that information and do a hard backup onto these logic diamonds, which he has hidden in separate locations. And if I had to make a guess, they'll probably resemble the object that we'd seen Apocalypse back up Nimrod's origin data on. And I mainly say that because back at the time in Moira's 9th life, the surviving mutants, which were just under 10,000, they had taken refuge within Shi'ar space, which just shows us once again, he's using ideas from hundreds of years in the future in order to solve the problems of today. Breaking all the rules, man, and it don't stop there. And so now also in year 10, both Charles and Magneto go to meet Emma Frost. And when they get here is when we begin to learn about the Quiet Council of Krakoa, which in my opinion sounds like a newer version of the Hellfire Club, and not in any kind of nefarious way, but much like the Hellfire Club, to whom Emma Frost is still involved with at this point, where she sits in their order as the White Queen. And they sound alike to me because the Hellfire Club is a group who collectively uses their influence to manipulate politics, to manipulate the economy, and doing so really just for the benefit of themselves. And so when Charles and Magneto meet up with Emma here, they ask her if she's heard about this new drug that's gonna shut down pharmaceuticals altogether, and with her being connected, she's like, yeah, sure, I've heard of it. And essentially Charles just tells her, yeah, that's us. But in the instance of the nations, like we talked about in the last video, who declined Krakoa's independence, this is the conversation before that, because it's here that Charles tells Emma about Krakoa for the first time. And at this point, which is year 10, which is post Genosha, when Emma hears this idea, she's immediately like, oh Magneto, I know you know better, putting all the mutants in one spot on an island again, where they will likely be killed again. And she's not wrong for thinking that, because that's exactly what it sounds like, a setup for the genocide of Genosha all over again, which essentially makes her beg the question, what is going to be different this time. And it's here that they both show her by actually taking her to Krakoa, which is really the selling point once she actually sees what they're doing. And it's also here where they make the offer that when the time comes and some nations decline, and some will because later on she'll tip the scale, but they didn't go too obvious and just try to mind control the whole world. But as for the nations in the red who decline, Charles and Magneto are proposing to her that she be the face of their legitimate trade, and air quotes on legitimate. But with her being the face of the brand, they would offer her 2 seats so that her and another, so they could successfully smuggle these plants to another country and offer the mutants a way out so that they can make their way to Krakoa. And so now at this point, the Quiet Council is very much in its early stages, and we do know eventually it will seat 12, but we don't know as of yet who are the 12 who will have those seats. And so for Emma to do this, Charles and Magneto offer her 2 seats in 20 years, which I guess is however much time for however many people to hold however many seats. But she's not content with the 20, so she gets Magneto to bump it up to 50, but then she's curious why are they offering 2 seats, and it's here where Charles lets her know that the other seat is for Sebastian Shaw, who she's reluctant to bring back since she just got rid of him, but she does agree to do so under the condition that she has a 3rd additional seat, to whom at this time we just don't know who that 3rd person is. And so now after this, when Xavier sends out the invitation to the mutants around the world, now that he's made provision for them to make their way to Krakoa, this is like your initial invitation, which was made possible through more or less Professor X drug smuggling, with the previous plans that he made with Emma Frost. And this is one of those things to where we've learned, like in House of X, that the whole process of bringing mutants to Krakoa in its entirety, it had its different steps, because initially you had some who were personally recruited, much like what we talked about with Cypher, but many of these initial recruits, they were more so brought in order to set things up and even prepare Krakoa to make this possible. And as we had seen later, when mutants would arrive, this would happen in different waves. So it's not like Professor X just asked one time and everybody said yes. And I feel like Tomi Shishido is a perfect example of that, because in Powers of 10, when we see him kind of walk away from Xavier's invitation, we know because of what we've seen in House of X that eventually he does change his mind, and eventually he does accept, even though he's like the leader of a death cult. So I guess at this time he was just open to trying new things. But this also begs the question with people like Mr. Sinister, who when we see him getting this invitation, he's packing up and he's coming immediately. But in his case, it wasn't necessarily much of a choice, because we had seen Xavier once again breaking the rules and pushing Sinister's influence back in year 1 when he made him collect mutant blood samples and focus heavier on mutant genetics, and made him forget this until a day that he would tell him to remember. And so when he invites Sinister to Krakoa, in the case of Sinister, it's more like he's being activated in year 10 to continue the plans which Charles had planted in Sinister's mind back in year 1. And so what I also like about this invitation is that we get to see the invitation going out to Namor, who at this point in time is well over 100 years old. And I feel like when it comes to every big event, you have to have a part where someone goes to Atlantis and they ask Namor for help and he tells them to just get out of his face, because more often than not, that's his answer, which is something that we've seen more recently within the War of Realms. But what I like here about the way that he turns down Charles, and at this point Namor probably feel like a broken record, man, but when he tells Charles, what I like about this is that when he tells him to leave, it isn't because he disagrees with what Charles is doing, but rather in these early stages, Namor just doesn't believe that Charles is serious, because Namor, he's been doing this longer than Charles has been alive at this point, and he's been fought and tested, and he's still standing. And it's for that reason when Namor is given an initial invitation, he declines, and he tells Charles to come back when he's serious, because he needs Charles to prove to him that this quote perfect little island is more than just the dream of a child. But that'll do it for this one, guys. So now if you can tell, I've kind of been trying to save like everything with Ascension in year 1000 to do like closer towards the conclusion of Powers of 10, and mainly for the purpose of just consolidating all that information, much like how I did in the beginning of the House of X playlist when I went through the previous lifetimes of Moira McTaggart, at least the ones we know about, and how that jump started House of X. And with that, I wanted to do something very similar with the Ascension in Powers of 10 in year 1000, just so I'm not throwing you guys all over the place. Alright, so as we know, with the huge shift with everything that's been going on with House of X and Powers of 10, we're definitely being set up for new titles. With Dawn of X, Uncanny X-Men, a new Excalibur series, Fallen Angels, Uncanny X-Force, and a new Marauder series, as far as I'm aware of. And I'm glad that this is happening now rather than later, because the X-Men needed this so bad. Especially with Marvel Legacy starting off a little weird for the X-Men, because at first it kind of had me like, okay, where are we going? But getting into House of X, where we jump in 1 month in the past from what is actually current day in the storyline. And when we see what happens here, it shows us that all the events that have taken place from the beginning of House of X up to this point, as far as life number 10 and year number 10, that these main events have taken place over the course of 1 month. And through it all, in this flashback, if you will, we finally see Moira McTaggart with Magneto and Charles Xavier in a section of Krakoa that is Professor X's secret cradle, which is titled Moira's No Place. And so now here's the thing with us seeing this. because with us seeing Moira here and us getting this confirmation that this is actually a place under Krakoa, but the interesting thing on top of this is that we know that there are more people there, or more mutants hiding, if you will, in this location. And I mainly say that because Hickman has hinted to us earlier in this series about there being rumors in Krakoa of Forge being under Krakoa. And so now in House of X issue 6, now that we know of Professor X's secret cradle, and more specifically the portion belonging to Moira, it then starts to beg the question like, okay, where's Forge? Does he have a no space? Is there no space for Charles? And however many others, which are things that are still left unanswered at this point, which I'm very sure we'll get to later with so many other X-Men titles rolling out. But I do appreciate the flashback allowing us to see this, because personally I have many curiosities going forward about when will Namor get involved, and us later on seeing the involvement of the Shi'ar Empire. But at this point in time, which is still 1 month ago, it's here where we see that announcement which Charles Xavier had given to the humans, which had occurred 4 days prior to the events in House of X issue number 1. But it's now when we get issue 6 that we see exactly how that played out, because at this point in time when Charles announces that the mutants had created a drug that could cure like Alzheimer's, influenza, ALS, and a number of cancers overnight, and how his dream and his vision was to just give this to mankind, which was very much true prior to Moira McTaggart and the new discovery of her mutant powers, which in House of X has brought the mutants to the point of, okay, this is the way that it needs to be done. And it's here where Charles tells the world that these pharmaceuticals are yours, but you gotta give us 2 things in return, with the first being the humans accepting the island of Krakoa as the nation state for mutants all across the world, which is one of those things to where when we start talking again about the Quiet Council of Krakoa, which we'll be doing in just a little bit, but it's one of those things to where it really looks like Hickman is showing us within this flashback like a glimpse of the Quiet Council, which operates out of Charles' secret cradle, and the people who have access here, like Moira McTaggart, they are the real people running the show. But furthermore, with Charles' announcement, with his request with Krakoa being recognized as a nation state, to where furthermore, anyone who is born mutant, like as soon as their powers manifest, they're granted citizenship to Krakoa where they can live among mutants, but also, and going to that second request, which was for Krakoa to have its own laws, which pertain to mutants, so that this way, in any future circumstance, if a mutant needed to be put on trial, they would have to go to Krakoa and be trialed there, rather than being sentenced by the rest of the world. And this is one of the biggest things that's been needed, because prior to this point, when mutants had been placed on trial, regardless to whatever crime they committed, because they were a mutant, they were immediately treated as a weapon of mass destruction, which for the humans was the only thing they could really categorize them as, because they didn't have any structure within the laws that dealt with this type of thing. And neither did they care to make the corrections to try to do this, because their priority was protecting the human race. And like we had seen recently when Sabretooth had went on trial after being captured by the Fantastic Four, at the time we had got a glimpse into some of the new laws that were set in place, which made it way easier for the ruling to convict a mutant because they're a mutant, which showed us when given the opportunity that the humans, when they changed the laws or passed laws that would determine the outcome in any court case or quote unquote protect citizens, all they really were doing were making mutants guilty till proven innocent. And so now fast forward to current day, slightly over 1 month after this initial announcement, and after all the events we had seen taking place within House of X and Powers of 10, as far as the portions pertaining to year number 10, which once again we are in Moira's 10th lifetime. And I know I do say that quite a bit when we jump back to here, but I feel like I need to anytime we do, because there's still quite a lot of people in the comments who get confused with the jumping around. But it's cool, I don't mind it at all. But it's here where we get our first real look at the Secret Council of Krakoa, or better yet, the Quiet Council of Krakoa, which we talked about for a little bit in the past couple videos, but this is our first time actually seeing everyone at the table. Well, almost everyone. And so now the way that this works, amongst the table you have 12 seats, and amongst those 12 seats, they're divided into 4 groups who will take the lead for a season, with the summer being Nightcrawler, Jean Grey, and Storm, the autumn which is Professor X, Magneto, and Apocalypse. And I'm sure when they put this together, they were like, okay, we have to put Apocalypse here next to Charles and Magneto, because if he sat anywhere else, he probably would have been like, man, y'all try to downplay me, I ain't having that. And I really feel like that's why Apocalypse is with the autumn group. And so now for the winter, you have Mr. Sinister, you have Exodus, and you also have Mystique. The spring, which is like all members of the Hellfire Club, and here we have the White Queen, Emma Frost, with also the Black King, Sebastian Shaw, who she didn't have much of a choice in giving this seat, with Charles and Magneto demanding that Sebastian Shaw sit here, even with it being against Emma Frost's request. But we do see this additional seat, which is like a sign of her counter offer when she did request that there be one additional seat, which we'll see later that she'll have a Red King sit in this chair, and it could be Alan Wilson, we really don't know who's gonna sit there yet. But next to this table where the seasons represent when which group would lead, and when I say lead, I mean more so in that season, that group would determine major decisions, like how they would handle external conflicts and the laws of Krakoa as well. So they couldn't go to one season and just be like, okay, bump all this, we in the lead, we taking all y'all out. Because if anybody might do this, it might be winter or spring. But the seasons really just represent a majority vote for a limited time only. And so right next to this table, you have two other parts. The first, which is just titled Krakoa, which is made of two people, Cypher and Krakoa. This portion of the Quiet Council is year round, and for obvious reasons, being that this whole thing is happening in Krakoa. And ultimately the input from the Krakoa division, or if Krakoa itself wanted to relay any information, it would speak through Cypher to share with the others. And so now last but not least, on the other side of the round table, you have the great captains. And amongst those captains, you have Cyclops, Gorgon, Bishop, and Magic. And so now as for the great captains, their task is mainly just to defend the state. And with the great captains, while they're in these meetings, they do have to side with the vote of the full council, but outside of here, when they step into the field, they're allowed to make any decision they see necessary. And perhaps maybe not a decision too radical, but even if so, if they can come back to the council and justify the means of that call, then this particular bylaw will protect them from any Krakoan sentencing. And so now one of our first examples of seeing the Quiet Council in action is actually in Judgment, which much like Nightcrawler expresses, is one of those things that just has to be done within a civilized society. Because with large numbers and especially growing numbers, some people are going to step out of line. And to much surprise, the first person who crossed that line was Sabretooth, which really wasn't much of a surprise. One, because of who he is and his history, but also within this council meeting, we get even further confirmation that he had directly disobeyed the orders of Magneto back when he did the data heist with Mystique and Toad, to where Magneto mentions he gave him strict instructions, and Sabretooth intentionally did not listen. And as it turns out, for his sentencing, because there has to be some type of punishment, because the decision they make here sets the tone. And when the council just recently coming up with their 3 laws in the first meeting, with the first stemming from a suggestion from Nightcrawler, when he suggested that they be fruitful and multiply, which turned into the first law, make more mutants. And with the second law being murder no man, this dropped Sabretooth into this weird situation of, yeah, this new law came out and you broke it. Which is why we essentially see Sabretooth for his punishment being banished. And with his banishment, he's more so just sedated and locked away under Krakoa, which is better than the death sentence, which by all means isn't something they want to do either, with it one being counterproductive to the first law being making more mutants, but also because Charles doesn't want Krakoa to be like the rest of the world and just having a flat out death sentence, but rather Sabretooth's punishment is just the means for this current time. And so now I also want to mention, before I get into the third law, like with the first one being make more mutants, second one being murder no man, but before I get into the third one, I do also want to mention, or more so a reminder, like we did find out back in Powers of 10, issue 5 I believe it was, that these different laws and even this structure with the different seasons and the different captains, that this wasn't something that was set in stone. And Hickman had kind of gave us a hint during Powers of 10 that eventually all of this may change, which I'm sure it will much later on as we see the laws evolve and grow, but as for now, this is the way it is for the foreseeable future. And Charles admits that it's not perfect, but the mutants have to do what's needed in order to create a better future for their own race, because if they don't, no one else will. And so now as for the third law, which is more so just respect this land, with the fact that this land is a living person, that just goes more so into the details of including Krakoa in their decisions and not treating him like property that they own. But ultimately, with what they have accomplished here, it is essentially the birth of a new nation. And let me tell you, man, like the mutants, they celebrated their independence to the fullest. And it's like, man, I can only imagine, like some of them were just like, yo, I'm finna party so hard, they're gonna have to remake my body. Like this one's about to be done, forget it. But of course, there's a process to that. You can't just be remade like we talked about before, like someone actually has to die. But also though, like Wolverine at the party, let's talk about Wolverine for a second, because he's making sure that everybody who is of age, of course, is drinking. But this also makes me wonder, like, what is the Krakoan drinking age? And I mean, from what I can see, Wolverine's making a pretty good call on who he selects. But then again, him, Cyclops, and Jean are literally like 1 week old. Okay, now I know I'm just thinking about this too much. But I also like that when we see Wolverine hand a drink to Tomishi Shido, like when I see that, it's like, okay, now we're making some progress. And so now as for Apocalypse, who's all to himself and like, you know, I'm not partying with those drug dealers, but even still, he's one of those guys you gotta watch, because clearly a lot more is going on in his head than he's actually sharing with everyone else. And it really makes me think of that moment within the council meeting when Sabretooth was on trial, when first Jean had made a statement about killing people who can't come back, and how if there's any law about killing, this should be it. And it makes me think about the response of Apocalypse when Charles asked Apocalypse like what did he think about it, because he was like, you know, I'm not gonna chime in and say who I think should and shouldn't be killed, because for Apocalypse that doesn't apply to him, because as far as he's concerned, he's gonna live forever. And for that reason, he doesn't want to try to make laws like men or mankind or like humans who stand on the outside, point their finger, and make laws for people who are not like them. And it's for that reason when we see Apocalypse here, it just puts me in the mindset of how long would he allow the birth of this new nation to continue until the point where he doesn't feel like it aligns with his beliefs. And sure, right now it does, and not perfectly, but enough that he'll accept it. But how long will it be till one day he's sitting in a meeting and he's like, you know what, this isn't working for me. And so moral of the story is look out for that dude in the corner at the employee party who's just sitting there quiet, because he might just jump up one day and be like, only the strong will survive, and you just be like, well, alright, well, here we go. But overall, within House of X, coming to its conclusion, we've been given enough information by Hickman to at least understand the core of how Krakoa came together and the workings and the structure of the Quiet Council. But I'll also say, like with Charles and Magneto, do keep in mind that there's more going on underneath Krakoa in Professor X's secret cradle, which is where I believe the real orders are coming from, with Moira's plan being a priority and the Quiet Council being formed to actually keep the mutants quiet and give a resemblance of order amongst the more powerful mutants, much like Apocalypse himself. Because the thing is, like, if you make him think he's in charge and you give him a seat at the council, which isn't like a fake seat, they do and they will execute the laws for Krakoa and sustain order within that country. And when the time comes, Magneto and Charles, they play their roles, but ultimately the ones with Moira McTaggart, that is the group who's originally calling the shots. And Apocalypse may already be figuring this out, and I got a feeling that pretty soon we'll be seeing exactly how that pans out. Alright, so jumping right back in, we start off here at the finale by going all the way back to year 1 in Moira McTaggart's 10th lifetime when she approached Charles for the first time in this 10th lifetime, but in this case we're given a bit more detail. Because back at the time when we originally seen this, it seemed like Moira McTaggart had given Charles everything that we'd seen throughout the timeline that we were given in those earlier issues, to where at the time it was missing lifetime number 6, and with the exception of lifetime number 10, because this is lifetime number 10 still playing out at this point. But at the time, it had seemed like she'd revealed to him everything from lifetime 1 up to lifetime 9 with the exception of lifetime number 6. But what we come to find out is that Moira shared much of this with Charles as well, revealing to him the 1000th year of her 6th lifetime. Okay, and so now prior to this point, I've been holding off on doing talks on the 1000th year, and mainly because I felt like a piece was missing. And of course, with Hickman's writing, there's always intentional pieces missing, but the part that I was looking for, we finally got in this issue. And lo and behold, it was in Moira's 6th life. But just as a quick recap to everything that's going on in this 1000th year, because at this point, much of it seems to play out the same way that we had seen in Moira's 9th life. And throughout her lifetime, we would get different examples, like no matter what she would do, like even if she would live this long, that regardless, certain factors would come to play out, like with mutants appearing to mankind and growing in large numbers, with some trying to help mankind and some not so much, which would eventually lead to humans bringing in a Sentinel program. And from there was the humans with the machines versus the mutants, which would always lead to the annihilation of mutants altogether. And so when we take a look into Moira's 6th lifetime, in year 1000, we're met here by the Librarian, who's arriving at the Preserve. And this is something that Hickman has shown us, like in Moira's 9th life, where we had seen Salabel captured, and then 1000 years later, she's still in Nimrod's archive being decrypted. And for Salabel, it took a long time to get any information out of her because she was designed with a black brain that was designed to not have information extracted from it. But at this point in the 1000th year, with the war pretty much being over, and Nimrod downsizing to like a Google Home, and the humans achieving their perception of evolution by merging with machine, which is essentially what the Librarian is, and what mankind has become at this point. But also with doing this, they've taken the archives which Nimrod created in year 100, which at the time was used for war tactics and strategy, but at the point of year 1000 after the war, it's like pretty much a library slash museum. And for the museum portion, you have a part that is called the Preserve, because in addition to the archives and the information that they have on the mutants and on how the world used to be, the Preserve was considered to be like this relic or this reminder of what this new human-machine hybrid had overcome. And more or less, really, it was life as we know it placed into a snow globe, just sitting here to be observed. And so when we see the Librarian in Moira's 6th lifetime, when the Librarian arrives here, and of course he's initially attacked, but of course is unsuccessful because he says he can think faster and react faster than anyone could attack him, and then he's greeted by Wolverine. But the Librarian makes it clear that he's here to give them a message, and with doing so, he switches from this future language back to English, which at this time, English is a dead language, with no one having spoken it in years. And with Wolverine telling him more or less, just cut the small talk, like what is this message that you have, the Librarian lets him know that he will, but he was just waiting for Moira McTaggart, to whom in her 6th lifetime, I have no idea how she lived this long, because at this point it doesn't seem like she's been altered by Apocalypse, like she hasn't even tried that route yet, but yet and still 1000 years later, here she is. And when Moira arrives, the librarian tells them that pretty much life as you know it and as you don't know it outside this bubble, it's all going to end tomorrow, with the humans reaching their last stage of evolution in the process of ascension when the Phalanx arrives and absorbs these human-machine hybrids into itself to eventually be merged with this supercomputer black hole, which is like the pinnacle of human-machine evolution. And throughout this conversation, the librarian breaks it down to like this was the whole plan, because much like how mutants are the evolution of mankind planted by the Celestials but evolved on Earth, the librarian explains that this doesn't compare to the idea of humans evolving beyond Earth. And to achieve this greater evolution, mankind looked to machines for biotechnology because it would evolve them faster than mutant evolution, which would take hundreds to thousands of years. And the librarian tells them like the different stages of this, like from Sentinels to Omega Sentinels to Nimrods, all the way up to year 1000, where the humans have become these machine hybrids, which are identified like as Homo novissima, like I think that's how you say it. But through the years, what we're discovering that this was eventually and possibly inadvertently like the humans' evolution from their creation of machines to the point of them eventually bonding with them, which would eventually lead to their ascension, which is like the final step where everyone gets turned into the part of like this super big galactic supercomputer. But at this point, Wolverine's heard enough, so he kills the librarian, who apparently wasn't quick enough to see this part coming. But at this point in time, this brings a very interesting element to Moira McTaggart's efforts up to this point, because she never knew that this is how it was going to end. But now that she does, she tells Wolverine to send her to her 7th life because this changes everything. And like we talked about before, like in the 7th life, then she tried to kill Bolivar Trask and she went on her whole assassination spree, but none of that worked. Then after that, in her 8th life, she went to Magneto, and in that life she died in the prison break. And in her 9th life, she went to Apocalypse, where they stole the Nimrod origin files, to where all of this brings us back to the beginning of lifetime number 10. And as it turns out, when we jump back to year 1 of lifetime number 10, when Moira had shown Charles her past and the memories of her lifetimes 1 through 9, we also come to find out by way of her journals, we also find out a couple things. Like for one, Charles didn't see absolutely everything, though he has seen most from her 9 lives. But with doing so, Moira has also described what she showed him as her perspective from a lot of these situations, which makes sense with it being her life. Like who else's perspective you gonna live your own life through? But with Moira's journal going on to tell us that she didn't allow Charles to read her a second time, and not that she never will eventually, but initially she didn't. But she goes on to describe that she does this as a bit of exercise of caution, because though she wants to change Charles so that he's no longer chasing this dream of humans and mutants living together peacefully, but rather saving mutant kind at any cost, she does understand that she's walking the line of this risk of fracturing Charles' psyche and eventually unleashing something unexpected to the world. And I know a lot of you guys have been like screaming for Onslaught to appear at some point in time, who's a possible contender, and I don't want to crush nobody's hopes, but I seriously doubt that this is going to happen, at least directly from the mind of Charles, and mainly because Onslaught is the combination of the psyche of Charles and Magneto, and I doubt that that would directly come from Charles. But we still have the possibility, like if the mutants in Krakoa still follow the suit of Mr. Sinister's betrayal, to where they combine different mutant powers into one copy, and with this Generation 3 process they can combine up to 5 mutants. And if they take this route and they combine Charles and Magneto, and God knows who else, Franklin Richards, whoever, but if they take this route and they create a new mutant that has both Charles and Magneto both inside of one body, and this mind breaks, then that's going to be one dangerous mix. So with that, Onslaught is possible, but not directly just right out of Charles. And so now in reference to New X-Men and Astonishing X-Men, because moving forward from year 1, we do know that a lot of things still take place, like the genocide of Genosha, which is the product of Cassandra Nova, who is another possibility that we talked about like in the first House of X video, and mainly because of the Genoshan genocide, and also the new version of Cerebro that Charles is wearing looks a lot like the one from New X-Men. And these factors make Cassandra Nova a possibility as far as Moira's biggest fear in releasing something terrible from the mind of Charles. And last but not least, before we move forward, you also have Phantom X, who's like Weapon 13 from the Weapon X program, who at the conclusion of Astonishing X-Men, he had voluntarily given his body to Charles Xavier so that Charles will later have an actual physical body. But in relation to what Hickman's doing and all the references we've got from Astonishing X-Men, it's very possible that all of this happened, but I strongly believe that somewhere around year 10 that Charles would have given him his own body back, or even a new body, rather than remaining to walk around in his. And I gotta say, like between Phantom X and Onslaught, like those were the two biggest, like most frequent comments, at least that I've seen that you guys were putting up in relation to the mystery of Charles Xavier and what might be down the line. And as crazy as it sounds, Onslaught is sounding like the most sound prediction, but we'll see. But so now back to lifetime number 10 and jumping to year 10. And at this point we get into this conversation that's taking place in Moira's no place, which is more or less Moira's section in Xavier's underground hideout underneath Krakoa. And throughout this conversation that they're having here, it's much like what we talked about in the previous video, and actually more than one video, I just didn't know where they were. But here we get into some of the inner conversations of the real leaders of Krakoa. Because on one hand, you do have the Quiet Council, who on the surface, literally and figuratively, they govern the land of Krakoa. They're the leaders that the people of Krakoa see, and they represent internal order within that nation. But like I mentioned before, the real leaders of Krakoa, they're the people in this secret hiding place. And we've been hinted to that Forge and others are here as well, and we'll probably see that in the newer Marauder series or something. But the people are here, they're the ones who are really making the rules. Which also leads me to the explanation of why Moira MacTaggert hasn't been seen through much of House of M. And long story short is because nobody needs to know what she knows. Because if somebody discovers this, then it compromises everything. But in addition to that, then if nobody can know her mutant power, then you have the case of, okay, well, why is this one human on Krakoa? So then rather than having that whole argument, once they were able to duplicate the bodies, they made another Moira and they killed her off in order to fake this one's death. And I swear, if that Moira who died is actually a mutant as well, and we got 10 more lives coming, I'm gonna lose it. But while they're all down here at this point in time, and Charles and Magneto are pretty much catching up Moira with much of what happened on the surface, with the Quiet Council being put together, and the whole situation with Emma Frost still having a seat reserved for the Red King, who at this point I think everyone knows who that's gonna be, mainly because of the comment section on the last video, and likely much of the comments under this video as well. But in addition to that, you also have the situation with Mystique, who had mentioned previously during the data heist back when Sabretooth was apprehended, but she had mentioned at the time that she needed something in return for everything that they were doing. And her request at the time, which we don't find out until now, that what she wanted was for Charles to bring Destiny back. And we talked about Destiny earlier on this playlist, like the version of Destiny from Moira's third lifetime, which gave Moira a warning about making a mutant cure and how the humans would eventually use it as a weapon. But the reason why Destiny isn't in Krakoa, it goes much deeper than that. Because here, the secret underground council, they've already established the rule that no precogs can come to Krakoa. Because if any do, not only will they discover Moira, but they would instantly become a liability. Like if anyone discovers like the Shi'ar Golem, which is where they have the backup of all the mutants, or even if the other mutants of Krakoa discover that in many of her past lifetimes everything went wrong. Like so many others would challenge their opinions and their decisions and their strategy, and like this would create chaos. And though many precogs like Destiny, for example, don't see the exact future how it exactly play out, but with even seeing a version of the future, like this would compromise everything and more likely do more harm than help. And though it does sound like something that could be a huge advantage, with this likely being Moira's last lifetime, because at this point her 11th life isn't definite yet, but even playing with the idea of bringing in a precog, and more specifically Destiny, who has had a romantic relationship with Mystique in the past, like this could get messy. And so now in response to Mystique, Charles did tell her that he would bring back Destiny, but he told her this knowing that he wouldn't do it. And really just thinking about that moment when she asked him and he like pulled the flash drive and made it fly to him, and like you guys were going crazy about this too, and like it could be a precursor to Onslaught, it could be, but there's a lot of other things that can mean as well. Because we have seen examples of Charles Xavier using telekinesis before, like in the early 60s or your 1610 universe, and more recently whenever, if ever mentioned, we're kind of just tossed between the idea of him having either just a low level of telekinesis and it draining him too much to use it all the time, but at this point with everything Hickman is doing, it's more likely going to tie back to him having it since the initial battle between him and Cassandra Nova, or his collaboration with the Shi'ar, like in Uncanny X-Men issue 167 when Moira was there when they gave him a new body, which allowed him to walk for a short while, but we'll likely get a different version of this where it was more permanent, being with all the new factors that have come into play with Powers of 10 and House of X. But just finishing my thoughts on the whole Mystique thing, and like I was saying as far as Charles telling her that he would bring back Destiny, which we know is something that he cannot do, and I mean he could, but he's not going to, and as a result I wouldn't be completely shocked if Mystique figured out a way to do this herself, because the resources are there. And I gotta tell you, like if Mystique figures out a way to do this on her own, like with finding the backups of every mutant, and then like disguising herself as Charles and making this happen to bring back Destiny, like this would cause a whole nother slew of problems. And as a result of doing so, Mystique comes back to the council and she just outs Professor X, Magneto, Moira, and she just spills the beans on everything. Like that would be crazy. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Like, anything is possible from here. And we talked about some of the upcoming titles like Marauders, Dawn of X, the new X-Force titles, Excalibur, and how a lot of these will really lead out much of what we've seen in Powers of 10 and House of X. And I'm pretty sure I have an idea what Marauders is going to do in association with the Hellfire Club and the Quiet Council. And I'm pretty sure a lot of those comments are going to be down below as well. But like I said, that'll do it for this one. Let me know your thoughts down below. Leave your predictions to what you think's around the corner. And also, what characters would you like to see return with a bit of a different twist? But let me know down in the comments, and we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, later.